Hey folks, welcome to tonight's journey back in time. Forget the shiny armour, the valiant warriors, and the pillaging fun you see in movies. We're going back to the real Viking life, and trust me, it's not as glamorous as Hollywood would have you believe. Before we dive into the grim details, gently press that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, but only if you actually enjoy what we do here at Feathers 10. And seriously, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing all of you from all corners of the globe. Now let's dim the lights, get comfy, and step into the boots of a Viking. Alright, you've just woken up in a Viking longhouse. Congratulations, you're still alive. That's a good start. But the smell is something else. Think of a mix of unwashed bodies, sweat, livestock, and the constant burning of wood in the hearth. It's like someone dropped an entire barn in your living room and said, "This is your home now." You sleep on a bed that's really just a pile of straw with some blankets thrown over it, and half of that straw is crawling with lice. Not exactly the luxurious Viking bedding you may have imagined. The worst part? You share this bed with your family, your livestock, and the occasional rat. So, privacy? Yeah, that's a myth. Now the good news is you're alive. The bad news? It's freezing cold. Your wooden hut might have a roof, but it's full of holes, and those gaps, they're for ventilation and letting the rain in. So you wake up, your back sore from the hard bed, your legs stiff, and if you try to stretch, it feels like your body is made of ancient oak. You roll out of bed after not being able to rot a few more minutes in bed while scrolling through TikTok. You stagger to your feet and immediately step into something wet. It's not rain, it's not water, it's the mix of animal waste, old food, and whatever else might be in the mud floor. Don't look too closely. Seriously, don't. And, oh yeah, breakfast. What's for breakfast in Viking times? Well, no eggs, no crumble cookies, and definitely no Starbucks coffee. Your breakfast is whatever you can find, which means probably a bowl of soured porridge, maybe some dried fish if you're lucky. Bread. If it's made from barley, it's more like a brick than something you can eat without risking a dental emergency. You wash it down with weak ale. That's right, even kids drink it. It's the only drink that won't immediately make you sick because guess what? The water is worse. So, cheers. You think maybe you'll enjoy a nice stroll after breakfast, but nope, it's time to work. And by work, I mean you're about to break your back doing hard labour for someone else's benefit. Whether you're farming, building ships, or forging iron, there's no break. You wake up at sunrise and you work until the sun sets. There's no such thing as getting off early. If you're lucky, you might get Sundays off, but not if there's raiding to do or if the crops need tending. And the weather? Oh, don't get me started on that. In the winter, your house is colder than the icy fjords outside. No insulation, no central heating. Just a fire you're constantly feeding with logs that cost more than your entire wardrobe. Summer isn't much better. You're roasting in your wool tunic while mosquitoes feast on your skin. The smell of sweat and smoke follows you around like a cursed cloud. But hey, it's not all bad. You could be out in the wilds with nothing but your axe, getting ready to raid a village, or maybe you're sitting in a smoky hall telling stories with the other warriors, drinking more weak ale and dreaming of the afterlife. If you're lucky, that might even be the highlight of your day. And just in case you thought hygiene was something the Vikings excelled at, think again. Bathing wasn't a daily thing. You'd get washed, if at all, by dipping yourself in a freezing cold river or using a bucket of water you had to fetch yourself. That's right, you've got no shower, no hot water, and definitely no soap. Don't even think about deodorant. If you were lucky, you might find some herbs to rub on yourself, but most days, you're just hoping you don't smell like death when you sit next to your comrades. But hey, at least you're a Viking, right? A little hard work, a little grime, but plenty of opportunities to prove yourself on the battlefield. It's not a glamorous life, but it's a damn tough one. And that toughness, that's what made them legendary. So grab your mead, sharpen your axe, and get ready for your life as a Viking. As a Viking, you weren't exactly the type to sit around sipping mead in cosy warm cabins. These guys were like the world's first real-life extreme adventurers. They didn't have Instagram to post their conquests, but if they did, it'd be full of violent raids, messy battles, and probably a few too many selfies holding up heads on pikes. Now, if you're thinking of Vikings as some romanticised warriors who rode into battle like the cast of a cool Netflix series, think again. The reality is much darker and much more brutal. First off, you've got to survive the cold. I mean, we're talking about a place where the winters aren't just cold, they're bone-chilling cold. It's so cold, you'd think even your thoughts would freeze. You're living in a wooden shack with no central heating, your roof's made of grass and turf, and you're stuck with a bunch of guys who really, really like to fight. Viking life isn't for the faint of heart. You don't get to be a Viking by being a peaceful farmer. You're a farmer with an axe, ready to raid the nearest village at the drop of a hat. Oh, and don't forget, you've got to deal with that Viking haircut, which wasn't so much about looking good as it was about practicality. Mostly, it was about making sure your enemies had something to grab onto when you're headbutting them in a brawl. But it's not just fighting that's your main hobby. Oh no, they've got a full agenda for fun. Besides raiding, pillaging and slaughtering, they also love themselves a good feast. We're talking giant, boar-filled, ale-saturated, horn-clinking, fire-blazing nights where you'd probably end up passed out before sunrise. So if you wanted to live your best Viking life, you better be able to handle alcohol and chaos in equal measure. You don't have a lot of time for anything other than survival. You don't get to live in a warm, cosy cabin, relaxing by the fire. You're out there in the elements, struggling to feed yourself and your family, knowing that any day now, your neighbours might decide it's a good day to raid your village. You can bet that when Viking men and women weren't out on those longships, they were busy sharpening weapons and trying to fortify their homes in preparation for the next inevitable attack. You live in constant fear of another tribe deciding your peaceful little patch of earth would make a perfect place for them to plant their flag and, more importantly, steal your stuff. And the Viking ships? Oh man, those things are no joke. If you've ever seen a Viking longship, you know it's built for one thing: destruction. These are war machines, not just boats. They can navigate rivers, coastlines, even frozen seas in the winter. You're not just cruising on a Sunday outing here, you're looking at an intense high-speed raid right into the heart of whatever poor village got unlucky that day. But here's a thing that a lot of people don't get about Viking society. You aren't just a bloodthirsty pirate. You had their own culture, your own beliefs, and a whole complex system of honour and respect. Sure, their idea of honour probably involved pillaging and plundering, but there was a code to it. For instance, if you were a Viking warrior, you were expected to fight for the glory of your god, which was mostly Odin, Thor and the gang, and in return, you hoped for a glorious death in battle. If you died in your bed of old age, that was seen as weak. The real goal was to die fighting. That's how you earned your place in Valhalla, the ultimate afterlife. So if you had to choose between living long enough to be old and miserable, or dying with your axe in your hand, the Viking way was simple: die with your boots on. And let's talk about the Viking ships for a second. Longships were the epitome of Viking technology. We're talking fast, lightweight, and capable of being paddled up shallow rivers or across the open ocean. These ships weren't just for travel, they were war machines designed for quick, brutal strikes. Imagine being a Viking and sailing into a village, raiding it, and then getting the heck out of there before anyone could even think of fighting back. No mess, no fuss, just pure, unfiltered chaos. But the Viking story isn't just about war and bloodshed, it's also about exploration. These guys were the real adventurers, long before Columbus set sail. Vikings travelled to parts of the world that most people didn't even know existed. They went all the way to North America, way before anyone else did. They discovered Greenland, Iceland, and maybe even parts of Canada. And all of this was done without GPS, smartphones, or even a decent map. They just hopped on their boats, crossed oceans, and basically said, well, let's see what's over there. And if it didn't work out, they just went home and tried somewhere else. Alright, so you've survived your Viking childhood without freezing to death, getting raided, or falling off a longship. Congrats. But don't get too comfortable, because now comes the next charming chapter of your miserable little life. Disease, filth, and a complete lack of basic hygiene. See, personal cleanliness wasn't exactly at the top of the medieval to-do list, and by not at the top, I mean it wasn't even on the list. Bathing? Maybe once a week if you were really fancy, and even then you were probably scrubbing yourself down in the same filthy river you just threw your enemies into after a raid. Soap? Kind of. They had a primitive version made out of animal fat and ashes. Sounds refreshing, right? The average Viking probably smelled like a combination of wet dog, fermented fish, and regret. And you think your gym smells bad after leg day? Buddy, you have no idea. The stench was so bad that some Viking raids may have succeeded because villagers just didn't want to get anywhere near them. Seriously, who needs weapons when you can just weaponize your own BO? But wait, it gets worse. Let's talk about food. If you thought medieval cuisine was all about hearty feasts and roasted meats, think again. Sure, Vikings could throw down at a feast when they had the chance, but day to day, you're looking at a delightful menu of barley gruel, dried fish, questionable meats, and whatever roots you could dig out of the frozen dirt. Oh, and if you were lucky, maybe some sour milk. Yum. Malnutrition was so common that most people didn't even reach what we'd now consider average adult height. The typical Viking man, about 5 feet 7 inches if he was lucky, and built like a tree stump, not a gym bro. Strong, yes. Ripped? Only if you count ribs poking through your skin because half the time you were borderline starving. And just when you think life couldn't get any grimmer, boom, here comes the disease parade. Lice, fleas, and worms were basically your constant roommates. Forget about modern medicine. If you got sick, your best options were 1. Hope your body somehow fought it off. 2. Pray to Odin. Or 3. Die dramatically enough to at least earn some respect. Minor injuries could kill you. You cut your hand on an axe? Congrats. You're now on the fast track to a raging infection and a slow, painful death. Toothache? You better hope you enjoy excruciating pain, because there's no dentist here, just a guy named Bjorn with a pair of rusty pliers and some very questionable ideas about surgery. But despite all this misery, Vikings didn't just sit around whining. Oh no! These maniacs leaned into it. Pain, hardship, constant existential threat. They turned it into a lifestyle. If life was going to suck anyway, they figured you might as well suck harder than everyone else and make sure your name got remembered. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Legacy. The Vikings believed that your reputation was your immortality. Carve your name into history, not by living a long life, but by living a loud one. Burn some villages, win some battles, die with a sword in your hand and a grin on your face. Entertainment. You love storytelling, sagas about gods, monsters and heroes. You also loved board games, like Nefertafel, basically Viking chess but bloodier, and sports that involve throwing heavy things at each other. You know, wholesome fun. But the real MVP of Viking daily life. Skalds. Poets who could recite epic tales or roast you into oblivion with deadly insults. A good skald was more dangerous than a sword, because while wounds heal, public humiliation lasts forever. And let's not forget, laws and government. You guys weren't wild anarchists. They had laws, councils called things, and even early versions of juries. Disputes were settled with debates, compensation payments, or, if all else failed, an axe fight. Efficiency. Now that you're good and filthy, half-starved and crawling with parasites, it's time to dive into the one thing Vikings were actually good at. War. Forget the Hollywood nonsense where Vikings show up in perfectly matching armour, swinging shiny swords in slow motion. Real Viking warfare was messy, chaotic, and so brutally personal that it made modern war look like a polite disagreement at a coffee shop. First things first, weapons. If you were rich, and by rich, I mean you owned more than one tunic, you might have a sword. These were prized, passed down through generations, given names like leg biter or skull splitter, because subtlety was not a Viking strong suit. But most Vikings? They fought with whatever they could afford. Axes, spears, knives, even sharpened farming tools. Congratulations, you're going into battle with what is basically a glorified hoe. And armour? Huh. If you weren't some nobleman with money to burn, your armour was a thick wool tunic, maybe some leather patches and a whole lot of misplaced optimism. Helmets were usually simple iron caps. You know those fancy horned helmets you see in movies? Complete garbage. No real Viking ever wore those, unless they wanted to get laughed off the battlefield and die looking like a drunken idiot. The battles themselves? Less organised, more screaming chaos. Imagine a stampede of angry, lice-infested men charging at each other with axes, screaming about glory and revenge, hacking and stabbing at anything that moved. There were no neat lines, no noble duels. It was pure carnage. If you slipped and fell in the mud, good luck. You were basically meat at that point. Tactics did exist, to be fair. Vikings often used the shield wall, locking their shields together in a wall of wood and muscle, pushing forward like a giant bloodthirsty bulldozer. It worked surprisingly well, until someone broke the wall, and then it was back to good old-fashioned throat-slitting and knee-breaking. And let's not forget the raids. Viking raids were a masterpiece of terror. They didn't just roll up to monasteries and politely ask for gold. They smashed down doors, torched buildings, slaughtered anyone who resisted, and dragged off anything valuable, including people. Monks, farmers, women, children, didn't matter. If you could be ransomed or sold, you were cargo now. The real secret weapon of Viking warfare wasn't just brute strength, it was fear. The mere rumour of a Viking longship on the horizon could send entire villages into blind panic. Kings would pay protection money just to avoid getting pillaged, basically the medieval version of a mafia shakedown. And it worked. Vikings got filthy rich, not just from stealing, but from being so terrifying that people paid them not to steal. But for all their bloodlust and brutality, there was a twisted kind of honour too. Dying in battle wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. You wanted to die with an axe in your hand, guts spilling out, grinning through the blood, because that's how you punched your ticket to Valhalla. Viking heaven, where the ale never stopped flowing and the fights never ended. If you died peacefully at home, old, sick, bedridden, sorry, you were basically screwed. No glory, no feasts, no Valkyries coming to scoop you up. Just an embarrassing footnote in history, remembered as that guy who coughed himself to death while everyone else was out stabbing monks. In short, live violently, die gloriously, or be forgotten. After you've butchered half of England and scared every priest west of Rome into wetting himself, what's next? Exploration. You see, Vikings didn't just stick around Scandinavia sharpening their axes and inhaling fermented fish fumes. No, they got on boats, horrible creaking death traps with a sail, and hurled themselves into the unknown. Why? Maybe for glory, maybe for gold, maybe just because they were so deeply allergic to staying home sober for more than a week. Their ships were called longships, and they were absolute engineering marvels. If your engineering standard doesn't immediately sink. These boats were long, narrow and low to the water, which made them fast and sneaky. Perfect for sliding up rivers, sneaking behind enemy villages, and giving the local population a heart attack before breakfast. And where did they go? Everywhere. England, pillaged. Ireland, pillaged. France, pillaged so hard that the French king just gave them land and said, "Here, it's called Normandy now. Please stop setting fire to everything." But they didn't stop there. Vikings pushed north into Iceland, a frozen wasteland where the only thing more dangerous than the weather was the food. They settled Greenland, which was so hilariously misnamed, spoiler, it's mostly ice, that it sounds like a bad real estate scam even today. And then, around the year 1000 AD, a Viking named Leif Erikson stumbled across an entirely new continent. That's right. Vikings discovered North America about 500 years before Columbus ever got lost and lied about it. They called it Vinland, which means wineland, because apparently they found some wild grapes and immediately thought, hey, we can definitely get hammered here. But of course, it wasn't easy. The Vikings found out pretty quickly that the locals, the indigenous peoples of North America, weren't exactly thrilled to see a bunch of screaming, axe-waving maniacs show up. Skirmishes broke out, arrows flew, and after a few years of trying, and mostly failing, to not die horribly, the Vikings packed it up and sailed home. Still, for a brief glorious moment, a handful of ragged Norsemen stood on the shores of a new world, looked around and thought, hey, needs more beer, and the exploration didn't stop. Viking traders and adventurers pushed east too, sailing down the rivers of Russia, making deals and enemies with Slavic tribes, Byzantines and Arabs. Some of these Norsemen, known as the Varangians, even ended up as elite bodyguards for the Byzantine emperors. Imagine that. A bunch of giant bearded Northmen standing guard in golden palaces, still probably smelling faintly of fish and murder. What drove them? It wasn't just bloodlust. It was that eternal, gnawing Viking hunger for more. More land, more loot, more stories to brag about after death. Because in the Viking mind, you didn't just survive life. You fought it. You conquered it. And you sang about it. Until the gods themselves were too drunk to ignore you. You might think Vikings were just angry farmers with a death wish, but there was method to their madness. It all came down to mythology. And not the Disney kind where everybody learns a lesson and sings a nice song at the end. Viking gods didn't promise peace, eternal happiness, or a cozy afterlife with harp music. Number. The Norse universe was brutal, chaotic, and doomed. The best you could hope for was to die screaming in battle, get noticed by Odin, and spend eternity fighting the same battle over and over in Valhalla until the end of time. If that sounds exhausting, congratulations! You're starting to think like a Viking. The Norse gods themselves weren't shining paragons of virtue. They were petty, vengeful, half-mad weirdos, basically humans, but with better hair and more lightning bolts. At the top you had Odin, the Allfather. Imagine Gandalf if he was a shady war criminal. Odin was obsessed with gaining more knowledge and power, and he didn't mind cheating, lying, or sacrificing an eyeball to get it. That's right. He literally plucked out his own eye and tossed it into a magic well just for a sip of wisdom. Hardcore. Then there was Thor, god of thunder, basically a giant red-bearded frat boy with a hammer the size of a cow. Thor smashed things first and asked questions never. People loved Thor because while Odin was out playing weird mind games, Thor was the guy who would punch a frost giant in the face just because it looked at him funny. And of course, there was Loki, the trickster, half-brother to Thor, full-time agent of chaos, Loki was the guy who'd set your house on fire, help you rebuild it, and then steal it again, all while making it somehow your fault. Fun fact, Loki once tied his testicles to a goat as part of a weird bet. This tells you everything you need to know about Norse humour, but it wasn't just gods. The Viking universe was crawling with monsters, giants, witches, wolves the size of mountains, and serpents that could wrap around the world. And worst of all, it was all going to end in Ragnarok, a cosmic death battle where the world burns, the gods die, and everything is reset in a glorious catastrophic bloodbath. Imagine waking up every day, grabbing your axe and thinking, well, the world's on fire anyway, better make my death interesting. That was the Viking attitude, and that's why you're laughing in the face of death. That's why you're risking everything to sail across oceans, to charge into battle, to carve their names into stone and legend. Picture a Viking longhouse. It's not some tiny cabin. It's a giant smoky wooden hall big enough to fit a couple hundred people, plus dogs, livestock, suspicious barrels, and a few unconscious warriors already passed out in the corners. The roof is low, the fire pits blaze, and the smell is a mix of roasting meat, burning wood, wet fur, and feet. Absolute paradise if you were a Viking. Feasts weren't just casual get-togethers, they were massive events, usually to celebrate a successful raid, a good harvest, a big religious festival, or the fact that someone important didn't die that week. Everyone important showed up. The chieftain, warriors, traders, skalds, poets, farmers, and anyone else who could swing an invite, or at least a decent bribe. The food? Think entire roasted animals, pigs, goats, maybe a very confused swan if you were fancy, plus bread, cheese, stews thick enough to drown in, and a suspiciously large amount of onions. Vegetables were there too, but honestly they were mostly seen as things that take up space on a plate where meat could be. And fish. So much fish. Salted, dried, smoked. If it swam, it got eaten. Now, the drinking. Oh boy. Vikings didn't drink water if they could help it. Mead, fermented honey wine, was the drink of choice, but beer and ale were everywhere too. Drinking wasn't just for fun, it was mandatory. You toasted the gods, the ancestors, the chieftain, the guests, your neighbour's beard, and the fact you hadn't fallen over yet. Skipping a toast? Insult. Getting drunk enough to brawl with a chair? Totally acceptable. The toasts were called Bruggerful, and every toast had to be at least as ridiculous as the one before it. Example: I swear by Odin's good eye that I will sail further than any man here, or at least until I fall off the ship. Cue applause, laughter, and someone falling off their stool immediately afterward. Of course, feasts weren't just endless food fights, there was just entertainment. Skalds told epic sagas about gods, heroes, and that one guy who wrestled a walrus and lost. Musicians played bone flutes, lyres, and drums made from things you didn't want to ask about. Story battles broke out, where poets tried to out-insult each other in clever, devastating verses. If you couldn't keep up, you were shamed, or at least had your cup stolen. And yes, fights still happened. You pack a bunch of armed, half-drunk warriors into a smoky room and brag about who's tougher. Fists will fly. Axes might too if things got spicy. But most of the time it was all considered good fun, and the guy who got knocked into the fire pit was expected to laugh it off, after, putting out the flames. As the night wore on, things got messier. People passed out under tables, dogs licked up whatever was spilled, and somewhere in the back 2 guys were arm wrestling for the last hunk of goat meat, while a very serious argument about whose grandmother wrestled more bears broke out. And when dawn finally crept in and the fires died down, the survivors, hungover, sticky, half naked, would stumble out into the cold morning mist, swear never to drink again, and promptly start planning the next feast. First, magic was absolutely real to the Vikings. They didn't sit around debating whether spells worked. They knew they did. If your cow dropped dead, or your fishing net ripped, or your wife suddenly hated you more than usual, someone had cursed you. No doubt about it. Probably that shady old woman down the road who talked to trees. The most powerful magic was called cedar. This wasn't cute stage magic. This was serious sorcery involving trances, chanting, strange staffs, and a healthy dose of fear. Practicing cedar meant you could see into the future, curse your enemies, control the weather, allegedly. Mainly it just rained anyway. Mess with someone's mind so they forgot how to hold a sword, or better yet, forgot they were supposed to stab you. Who practiced cedar? Mostly women, called vulvas, or zaidkonas, wandering priestess prophetesses wrapped in cloaks, carrying staffs and looking like they absolutely had everyone's fate written in a secret notebook. But the god Odin also practiced it, which was considered a little controversial, because in Viking society, magic was seen as extremely unmanly. Real men were supposed to smash things with axes, not chant in circles wearing mysterious necklaces. So Odin, being Odin, just didn't care what anyone thought, because when you're the All-Father, you make the rules. Runes were another way the Vikings tapped into the supernatural. Runes weren't just letters, they were some magical symbols that could protect you, curse someone, help you win a battle, make sure your crops grew bigger than your neighbours, the true Viking flex. You didn't just write runes, you carved them into weapons, jewellery, bones and stones, sometimes in secret places, just to freak someone out months later when they found it. There were runes for victory, love, luck, and even binding enemies. Basically magical post-it notes, but way cooler and way more dangerous. Then there were the berserkers. Oh boy, these guys were the original terrifying semi-naked human hurricanes. Berserkers were elite Viking warriors who went into battle in a berserk gang, a blood-mad, trance-like rage where they howled like wolves or bears, felt no pain, didn't recognise friends from enemies, fought until they physically couldn't move anymore, or until everyone else was dead. How did they do it? Some say they drank potions made from mushrooms, alcohol, and pure bad decisions. Some say it was deep breathing techniques, chanting, or self-hypnosis. Some say they were just naturally built different and liked to headbutt trees for fun. Berserkers often wore animal skins, usually bear or wolf pelts, and believed they became those animal spirits during battle. If you saw a giant bearded man foaming at the mouth, shrieking like a banshee, charging at you with an axe bigger than your head, you didn't fight him, you just ran, fast. Now time to ask the big question, would you survive as a Viking? In theory, yes, if you like freezing, starving, bleeding and rowing for 12 hours straight. Vikings had some upsides. They could travel, fight for glory, and maybe earn a spot in Valhalla instead of just dying anonymously. But the downsides? Pretty brutal. Disease, violent deaths, awful winters, and no one cared about your feelings. Survival depended on being tough, lucky, and meaner than everyone else. And even then, you were probably one bad raid away from a spear in the gut. So, could you survive? Maybe. Would it be miserable? Absolutely. The history of the Vikings was significantly shaped by charismatic and powerful rulers who not only formed their own realms, but also had a lasting influence on the course of European history. In this section, we examine two of the most influential Viking kings, Harold Fairhair and Nut the Great. Harold Fairhair, also known as Harold I Horfagre, is considered the first king to unite Norway into a single kingdom. His reign from around 872 to 930 AD marks a crucial turning point in Scandinavian history. He revolutionised Norway's political landscape and established a system of rule that formed the basis for the medieval Norwegian kingdom. Harald Fairhair's ascent began in his youth as the heir to a small kingdom in Vestfold. According to legend, he vowed not to cut his hair until he'd united all of Norway under his rule, hence his nickname Fairhair. His conquests began at the age of about 20 and lasted around 10 years. During this time, he systematically subdued the various small kingdoms and jarldoms of Norway. The decisive turning point was the Battle of Hafrsfjord around 872, in which he overcame the last resistance of the opposing petty kings. This battle is considered today as the birth of a united Norway. Harald Fairhair's most important political achievement was the creation of a centralised administrative structure. He introduced the system of jarls, loyal administrators who controlled various regions in his name. At the same time, he created a new tax system that strengthened royal power and formed the basis for a functioning state apparatus. He also established the odel right, an inheritance law that regulated land ownership and continues to influence the Norwegian legal system to this day. His reforms in the areas of jurisdiction and administration laid the foundation for an orderly state system. Canute the Great, who ruled from 1016 to 1035, was one of the most powerful rulers of his time. He created a Nordic empire that encompassed England, Denmark and Norway, and at times also controlled parts of Sweden. His reign marked the height of Viking power in Europe and showed a remarkable fusion of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon culture. Canute's rise to power in England began with the invasion of his father Swene Forkbeard in 1013. After his father's death, Canute took leadership and initially had to assert himself against Edmund Ironside. The decisive moment came in 1016 when, after several battles and Edmund's death, he was recognised as King of England. His rule over England was characterised by remarkable political wisdom. He retained large parts of the Anglo-Saxon administration and integrated the local aristocracy into his system of rule. Canute pursued a policy of reconciliation, respected English traditions, and promoted cultural exchange between Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons. He modernised the legal system and ensured efficient administration, which brought England a long period of peace and prosperity. Canute's rule extended far beyond England. After the death of his brother Harald II, he also became King of Denmark in 1019. In 1028, he conquered Norway, thus creating a vast Nordic empire that dominated the North Sea. His imperial policy was characterised by skillful diplomacy and the ability to unite various cultural and political traditions. He promoted trade between the different parts of his empire and created an efficient administrative system that held the different regions together. Particularly noteworthy was his church policy. He actively supported the Christian church and promoted the construction of churches and monasteries, which contributed to the further Christianization of Scandinavia. His monetary reform unified the currency system in his empire and promoted economic exchange. Under his rule, both England and Scandinavia experienced a golden age of art and culture. Canute the Great understood how to combine Viking traditions with Christian European elements, thus creating a multicultural empire that was far ahead of its time. Harald Hardrada, also known as Harald III of Norway, was one of the most fascinating Viking kings of the 11th century. Born around 1015, he led an exceptionally adventurous life that took him from Scandinavia to Byzantium and finally back to Norway. As the half-brother of Olaf the Holy, he had to flee into exile after Olaf's death in 1030, marking the beginning of his remarkable career. Harold's military career began in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor, where he quickly made a name for himself as a skilled tactician and fearless warrior. In Constantinople, he rose to become the commander of the Varangian Guard and led successful campaigns in the Mediterranean region. His campaigns stretched from Sicily to Jerusalem, during which he amassed considerable wealth. The Byzantine chronicles report on his tactical innovations and his ability to coordinate complex military maneuvers. Particularly noteworthy were his successes in naval warfare, where he combined traditional Viking tactics with Byzantine military strategy. After his return to Scandinavia, he used his military expertise to assert his claim to the Norwegian throne. In numerous battles against the Danish king Magnus the Good, he demonstrated his tactical skill until he was finally crowned King of Norway in 1046. As King of Norway, Harald Hardrada proved to be a capable, albeit strict ruler. His reign from 1046 to 1066 was characterized by significant administrative reforms and the consolidation of royal power. He introduced an efficient tax system and promoted trade, which elevated Norway to a significant power in the north. He paid particular attention to the development of Trondheim as an important trading centre. His rule ended tragically at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when he fell in an attempt to conquer the English throne. His death symbolically marked the end of the Great Viking expansion. The Vikings left behind a rich legacy of historical personalities and legendary heroes whose stories are preserved in the Nordic sagas. Eric the Red, who discovered and settled Greenland, is one of the most famous Vikings. His voyages of discovery and the founding of the first European settlements in Greenland significantly shaped the expansion history of the Vikings. His son Leif Erikson went even further and became the first European to reach North America, where he founded the settlement of Vinland. Ragnar Lothbrok, whose life oscillates between history and legend, became famous for his bold raids and his dramatic end in a snake pit. The stories of Egil Skallagrimsson, the skald and warrior, combine poetic talent with typical Viking fighting prowess. The accounts of Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, one of the most widely travelled people of her time, show the significant role of women in Viking society. Bjorn Ironside, the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, became known for his successful campaigns in the Mediterranean region. These personalities embody the various aspects of Viking culture: spirit of discovery, warrior skills, poetic talent, and trading genius. Their stories were recorded in the sagas and continue to inspire to this day. They demonstrate the diversity of Viking achievements, from military conquests to voyages of discovery to cultural achievements. The legends surrounding these personalities often blend with historical facts, which makes them particularly appealing. They show the Vikings not only as warriors, but also as explorers, traders, and statesmen who had a lasting impact on the history of Northern Europe. The Vikings' art of war was a highly developed and feared combination of tactical skill, superior weapon technology, and innovative shipbuilding. These aspects significantly contributed to their military success and expansion. Viking warriors, also known as berserkers, were more than just fierce fighters. They embodied a complex warrior system based on years of training and strict codes of conduct. Their skills were passed down from generation to generation and constantly refined. The training to become a Viking warrior began in early childhood. Young men first learned to handle light weapons and shields. The training covered various areas: physical fitness through strength exercises and endurance training, weapons knowledge and combat techniques, tactical training for various combat situations, mental training to strengthen combat morale. The training often lasted several years and was conducted by experienced warriors. Particular emphasis was placed on mastering different types of weapons. The Vikings developed sophisticated combat tactics that were far ahead of their time. The shield wall formation, a defensive tactic where warriors positioned themselves closely together with overlapping shields. Lightning-fast raids from the sea, psychological warfare through intimidating battle cries, and wearing fear-inspiring armour, flexible combat formations that could quickly adapt to various battle situations. These tactics were perfected through intensive exercises and were key to their military success. The Vikings' arsenal of weapons was diverse and highly developed. Each weapon was forged with the utmost care and was often a masterpiece of the blacksmith's art. The most important Viking weapons were the longsword, a double-edged blade about 90 centimetres long, often with artistic decorations. The battle axe, ranging from light-throwing axes to heavy two-handed axes. The sax, a single-edged short sword for close combat. Spears, suitable for both throwing and close combat. The Vikings' forging technique was particularly advanced. They used Damascus steel and other high-quality materials. The Vikings' protective equipment included round wooden shields with iron fittings, chainmail for wealthier warriors, helmets, mostly without horns, unlike popular depictions, leather armour for greater mobility. The protective equipment was individually tailored and offered a good compromise between mobility and protection. Viking ships were technological masterpieces of their time and enabled their far-reaching expeditions and military successes. Viking ships were characterised by several innovative features: clinker-built construction for better stability and speed, symmetrical hull for turning manoeuvres without having to turn around, shallow draft for river travel and landings, combined sailing and rowing technique. The construction method was perfected over generations and enabled both deep-sea voyages and river expeditions. The Vikings developed advanced navigation techniques, use of sunstone for orientation, observation of bird flight and ocean currents, astronomical navigation, use of early forms of the sun compass. Their seamanship skills allowed them to navigate even under the most difficult conditions and cover long distances. The combination of superior weapon technology, sophisticated warfare, and advanced shipbuilding made the Vikings a dominant power of their time. Their military innovations had a lasting influence on warfare in Europe, and many of their techniques were adopted by other cultures. Norse mythology formed the spiritual and cultural foundation of Viking society. This rich belief system not only shaped the daily lives of the Norsemen, but also significantly influenced their power structures and social values. The Norse pantheon included a multitude of deities who stood in a complex hierarchy to one another. This divine order was also reflected in the secular power structure of the Vikings. Odin, the All-Father, stood at the top of the pantheon. As the god of wisdom, war and poetry, he embodied many qualities that were also expected of Viking kings. Thor, the god of thunder, was particularly popular among warriors and common people. His strength and sense of justice made him the protector of humans. Freya, as the goddess of love, fertility and war, also held a significant position. Other important deities were Tyr, the god of law and honour, Heimdall, the guardian of the gods, and Loki, the cunning trickster. The stories of the Norse gods were passed down in the form of sagas and tales. The world tree Yggdrasil connected the 9 worlds. The creation story told of the world's origin from the primordial chaos Ginnungagap. Particularly significant were the prophecies about Ragnarok, the end of the world in which the gods would perish in a final battle. These stories conveyed important moral values and codes of conduct. The Vikings' religion was closely tied to their way of life and their understanding of honour and fate. The belief in fate, Weird, and the Norns, who determined the destiny of humans, was central. Religious rituals played an important role in Viking life. Blot sacrifices were performed at certain times of the year, during which animals, food, and sometimes even humans were sacrificed to the gods. The Yule festival in winter was one of the most important celebrations. Other significant ceremonies included naming ceremonies for newborns, initiation rites for young warriors, and burial rituals. In burials, it was believed that fallen warriors were taken to Valhalla, Odin's hall. The Vikings built temples and cult sites that served as a connection between the human and divine worlds. The most famous temple stood in Uppsala, Sweden. Sacred groves and sacrificial stones were also important cult sites. Thing sites, which served as assembly places, often had religious significance as well. The boundaries between political and religious places were fluid, as belief permeated all areas of life. The transmission of mythological traditions was mainly oral, through skalds, the professional poets and storytellers of the Vikings. The Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, which were only written down in the Middle Ages, are the most important sources for our current knowledge of Norse mythology. They contain poems about gods, hero songs, and mythological tales. The kennings, poetic circumlocutions in skaldic poetry, show the close connection between religion and art. Pictorial representations on runestones, jewellery, and everyday objects complement the textual traditions. In Old Norse, the language the Vikings spoke, a Viking was a seaborne raider, and to go a Viking was to undertake seaborne raiding. Angus Somerville and Russell Andrew MacDonald, both professors at Brock University in Canada, wrote in their book The Vikings and Their Age, University of Toronto Press, 2013. The word is a job description, but it applied only to a small minority of the population, as many people in Scandinavia would not have taken part in raids. Among those who did raid, being a Viking was a part-time job since Viking expeditions were undertaken seasonally by small farmers, fishermen, merchants, chieftains, and aristocrats as a means of supplementing their income and winning fame, Somerville and MacDonald wrote. The word Viking was rarely mentioned in written sources during the time the Vikings were active. It was not until the 19th century that the term passed into common English usage, where it has generally come to be used as a descriptor for the peoples of Scandinavia in the period from the late 8th to the 11th centuries. Somerville and MacDonald wrote, "The Vikings intermarried or otherwise had children with the people they encountered. This meant that some Vikings were not of entirely Scandinavian ancestry." A study published in the journal Nature in 2020 found that there was a lot of genetic diversity in coastal areas of Scandinavia. Despite the popular belief that Vikings had blonde hair, the study found that many had brown hair. Modern-day historians use the term Viking Age to describe a period when the Vikings were expanding and launching raids. The years 793 to 1066 are frequently cited as defining the period, Somerville and MacDonald wrote, but these dates are subject to debate. In 793, the Vikings raided a monastery on Lindisfarne, an island off the east coast of Britain. They killed people and made off with a substantial amount of loot. The year 1066 was when William the Conqueror successfully invaded England. He led the Normans, a people who included Viking descendants. Although the Vikings originated in Scandinavia, they travelled to and lived across a vast area. The most distant western outpost known today is at Lonceau Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland in North America. While this outpost may have been in use for only a short time, there were Viking colonies on the western shore of Greenland that were used for centuries. The Vikings also travelled to the Middle East, reaching Constantinople and Baghdad by the 830 S. John Haywood, an independent researcher, wrote in his book Northmen, the Viking Saga, AD 793 to 1241, Thomas Dunn Books, 2015. In Eastern Europe, Vikings conquered settlements and formed a state called Rus in the 9th century, Haywood noted. They would unsuccessfully lay siege to Constantinople in 860. The pantheon of Norse gods contains at least two tiers, the superior Aesir and the lesser Vanir, Sebjörg Valaka Nordaide. who was a medieval history professor at the University of Bergen in Norway, and Kevin Edwards, an emeritus professor of physical geography at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, wrote in their book The Vikings, Arc Humanities Press, 2019. The veneer includes the deities Freya, Freyr and Njörður, while the Aesir includes Odin and his son Baldur. The two groups are constantly at war, which maintains an equilibrium, Nordider and Edwards wrote, noting that there were also intermarriages and relationships between the groups, such as between Odin and Freya. In addition to these two pantheons, there were also mythological creatures, such as the Jötnar, who were in conflict with the gods. There was also a belief in Ragnarok, a world-ending event in which a being named Surtur would kill the gods and engulf the world in flames. In the 9th century there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland, and the inhabitants may have believed that Ragnarok was taking place. They built a boat-shaped structure out of rock in a cave and burned animal bones, possibly in an attempt to strengthen Freyr, a Viking fertility god who fought Surtur, archaeologists found. Contrary to popular belief, the Vikings did not wear horned helmets. Steve Ashby, a senior lecturer at the University of York in the UK, and Alison Leonard, an independent researcher, wrote in their book Vikings, Thames and Hudson, 2018. A complete helmet from Gjermundbu, Norway, has a number of composite iron sections. The Vikings had a writing system. During most of the Viking Age, writing in Scandinavia consisted mainly of simple, short inscriptions called runes on stone, bone or wood, Nordider and Edwards wrote, noting that literacy among the Vikings was likely low. Elite members of Viking society were sometimes buried in boats. Boat graves would seem to have held special significance for the Scandinavian countries, Nordider and Edwards wrote. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 125 AD. The good news, you're not a barbarian. The bad news, you still might die from a stubbed toe. Your bed. It's a sagging pile of straw dumped onto a wooden frame that creaks ominously every time you move. No mattress, no pillows, just a scratchy old blanket that smells faintly of goat and last week's sweat. Egyptian cotton? Please. You're lucky if the rats haven't chewed holes through your only tunic while you slept. You blink awake as the neighbour's rooster screams through your paper-thin walls. Or maybe it's the shouting from the streets, or a drunk legionary trying to find his sandals. Either way, you're up. Your home is a single cramped room, probably built out of wood, mud brick, or if you're fancy, stone. But don't get excited. It's basically a giant oven in the summer and a freezer in the winter. Privacy? Never heard of her. You share your house with your entire extended family, a couple of chickens and whatever vermin decided to move in that week. The smell is something between wet dog, spilt wine and humanity just giving up. There's no Febreze, no air fresheners, and definitely no plumbing in most homes. Well, unless you're a millionaire senator. Spoiler, you're not. You try to stretch and immediately regret it. Your back sounds like someone stepping on dry twigs. You're 25 years old, which means you're edging toward your Roman midlife crisis. Your joints crack, your teeth ache, and your stomach's already starting to grumble. But first, nature calls, and in ancient Rome, that's a whole different kind of horror show. Forget the cosy little bathroom. You're heading to the latrine, a long bench of holes over a shared channel of running water where you sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Think public restrooms today are bad. Imagine trying to have a private moment while the guy next to you discusses grain prices. No toilet paper either. Romans used a sponge on a stick, dunked in vinegar between uses. Communal, sponge, on, a stick. If that visual didn't kill your appetite, breakfast will. You don't get coffee, you don't get bacon, you get pulse. A sad beige porridge made from spelt or barley, boiled until it's the consistency of sadness itself. If you're lucky, you might get a chunk of stale bread, maybe some olives if it's a good day. Water? Maybe, if you trust it. But most people just drank weak wine mixed with water to kill the germs. 6 in the morning? Too bad. Bottoms up. And no, you're not lounging around in a toga. That's ceremonial wear. Daily clothing is simpler and smellier. a rough tunic tied at the waist, already stained from a dozen things you'd rather not identify. Washing your clothes means scrubbing them in lye and urine. Yes, pee was a literal cleaning agent. Even worse, laundry was often a public job done by slaves who stomped on the clothes in vats of human waste. So enjoy that fresh scent clinging to your body all day. Now, you're dressed, underfed, and clinging to a thin hope you won't be eaten alive by lice before noon. Ready for work? Too bad. Your day's just getting started. Yes, you can be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. Under Roman law, the forests, rivers, and even certain types of fish belonged to the state or to the emperor himself. Wood was critical for survival, to build, to heat, to cook, but stealing even fallen branches from imperial land could be seen as theft against the emperor. Punishments? Harsh and very public. A flogging at minimum, forced labour in the mines if you were unlucky. Death if you were seen as a repeat offender. The mines, by the way, were a death sentence themselves, a place so brutal that slaves prayed for a quick end. Inside your Roman domus, if you were lucky enough to own one, or more likely your cramped insular apartment, life wasn't glamorous. Rome was crowded, painfully so. Think of tens of thousands of people packed into apartment blocks so rickety that fires were constant and entire buildings collapsed regularly, crushing dozens underneath. The higher up you lived, the poorer you were. 5th or 6th floor, you were one heavy rainstorm away from death when the walls gave out. There were no elevators. You hauled your water, your grain, your firewood up endless flights of stairs. Winter inside the city was brutal in a different way. Rome's Mediterranean climate didn't mean endless sunshine. Rain flooded the muddy streets, chilling you through your thin wool tunic. Heating? Maybe a small brazier of coals if you could afford it, and with the ever-present risk of carbon monoxide poisoning because ventilation was non-existent. Shivering under a single worn blanket, you slept with rats nibbling at the edges of your mattress, or your toes if you were too still. And then there's the water. The aqueducts brought in clean water, in theory. But once it hit the public fountains and cisterns, contamination was rampant. Waste ran freely through the streets. Public latrines existed, yes, but privacy didn't. You sat elbow to elbow with strangers on long stone benches with holes carved into them, chatting about the weather while flies buzzed around the filth. Romans wiped themselves with a communal sponge on a stick, dunked in dirty vinegar water between uses. You can imagine how many infections began right there. Summer in Rome was a different nightmare. Without air circulation, the air hung heavy with the smell of sweat, garbage, human waste, and death. Disease stalked the alleyways, malaria, typhoid, and countless unnamed fevers. Corpses of the poor sometimes rotted where they fell, because burial fees were expensive and no one claimed the dead unless they had to. Vermin thrived in the heat, and the stench of the Tiber River, clogged with refuse and rot, thickened the air even more. Food was survival, not pleasure. If you lived in the countryside, your diet was hard bread, olives, lentils, and whatever vegetables you could grow. Maybe salted fish if you were close to the coast. In the city, the grain dole, the anana, kept the poorest citizens alive. Free or subsidised grain, handed out by the state to prevent mass riots. Bread baked from this was often adulterated with sand or chalk to stretch supplies. Your teeth wore down prematurely, scraping against hidden grit in every bite. Meat? A rare luxury for most. A tough, sinewy cut from a half-rotted carcass at best. More often, you ate what we might now call variety meats. Intestines, feet, snouts. Anything that could be boiled or roasted into something vaguely edible. Medicine? A wild gamble. Roman doctors had some knowledge. Surgery for battlefield wounds, herbal remedies, and primitive dental work. But for the average Roman, medicine was a mix of superstition and guesswork. A snake bite might be treated by tying a dead rooster to the wound. A headache could earn you a poultice of crushed worms. Bleeding was considered good for many illnesses. If you were sick and poor, your chances weren't good. And if you were rich, your chances weren't much better, just more expensive. Marriage? It wasn't about romance. It was about alliances, family reputation, property. Girls often married at 12 or 13, boys a few years later. Fathers arranged matches based on dowry size and political advantage. Divorce was common, shockingly so compared to later societies, but the motives were practical, not emotional. If a better marriage opportunity arose, a letter of divorce could be delivered casually with a few witnesses. Marriage, love, and sex were almost completely separated concepts for the Romans, especially among the elites. Crime. Roman cities swarmed with thieves, conmen, and cutthroats. The city patrols, the vigils, tried to keep order, but the back alleys belonged to the gangs. Punishments were harsh and very visible: flogging, branding, exile, crucifixion. Public executions were spectacles, meant to terrify the masses into obedience. Slaves could be tortured not because they were guilty, but just in case they knew something about a crime their master committed. Slavery wasn't just a feature of Roman life, it was the engine. Rome didn't function without slaves. Not in the fields, not in the houses, not in the streets. Slaves made up about a third of the entire population. In cities like Rome itself, slaves outnumbered free citizens. Some were born into slavery, others were prisoners of war, debtors, or victims of piracy. You could be kidnapped from the fringes of the empire and wake up sold at auction in the heart of Rome. A price tag hung around your neck. Slavery could mean anything. You could be a galley slave chained to an oar, rowing until your heart exploded. You could be a farmhand breaking your back under the hot sun, whipped for moving too slow. Or, if you were lucky, very lucky, you might end up as a domestic slave in a wealthy house, cleaning, cooking, tutoring children. Somehow slaves earned trust, small freedoms, even manumission. The chance to buy or be granted their own freedom after years of service. But even in the finest houses, you were property, a thing. If you were beaten, mutilated, raped, or killed, there was no justice for you, only replacement. Entertainment in Rome was soaked in blood. The games, ludi, were not rare events. They happened constantly. Gladiator fights, animal hunts, public executions staged as mythological plays. The Colosseum alone could seat around 50,000 people. Imagine the roar of that crowd as two men, trained killers, hacked each other to pieces with short swords. Not all gladiators fought to the death. They were expensive investments, but death was always an option if the crowd demanded it. And when criminals were executed, it wasn't just a beheading or a hanging, it was a spectacle. Condemned men might be thrown to wild beasts or forced to reenact myths, like being tied to a wooden bull and burned alive while dressed as a mythological villain. People loved it. Senators, commoners, slaves, all sat side by side howling for blood. For many Romans, life was so grim that watching others die was a release, a brutal reassurance that they had survived another day. Women in Rome had more visibility than in many ancient cultures, but little real power. Legally, a woman was under the authority of her father or her husband for most of her life. Only a rare few, usually very wealthy widows, had genuine independence. Most Roman women married young, bore children, managed households. Some educated women wrote poetry, studied philosophy, even ran businesses. But for most, life was a tight circle of domestic duty and social expectation. A Roman woman's reputation, her pudicitia, her modesty and virtue, was everything. Public shame could destroy an entire family's honour. A woman could be divorced simply for being seen talking too casually with another man in public. There were no second chances. Children had no protected innocence. Boys were expected to become miniature adults early. At age 7, a Roman boy often began formal education if his family could afford it, learning Greek, Latin, rhetoric, philosophy. By 14, he was training for public life. Sons of farmers. They worked from the moment they could carry a tool. Girls were even less coddled, taught to spin wool, manage servants, obey their fathers. By puberty, they were expected to be ready for marriage, childbirth, motherhood, and there were many who didn't make it that far. Infant mortality was staggering. Estimates suggest nearly half of Roman children died before the age of 10. Diseases, accidents, poor sanitation. Every day was a battle for survival. And if you were born unwanted, wrong gender, wrong time, wrong father, you might simply be abandoned. Left outside the city gates, exposed to the elements, to animals, to death. Sometimes poor families did it out of desperation. Sometimes rich families did it to correct the shape of their airlines. There were no social services. Mercy depended on luck or the kindness of strangers. Education wasn't a guarantee of a better life either. For many poor Roman boys, school was a rare luxury. Instead, they learned trades from their fathers: masonry, carpentry, blacksmithing, farming. For most Romans, literacy was partial at best. Enough to sign your name, maybe read a price list. True classical education, learning Cicero, Virgil, Plato, that belonged to the elite. Meanwhile, everyday life was under constant watch of invisible forces: omens, curses, portents. A dead crow in the road, bad luck. A dream about fire, a warning. Superstition was deeply woven into life. Amulets, spells, charms. Common tools for ordinary Romans trying to fend off the chaos they couldn't understand. Joining the Roman army wasn't just a career move, it was a contract with blood. Roman soldiers, legionaries, signed up for at least 25 years of service. 25 years? Imagine that. Most recruits were teenagers. Few would live to see retirement. Training was brutal from day one. Marches of over 30 kilometers a day, wearing full armor, chainmail, helmet, shield, sword, sometimes more than 30 kilograms of gear. Punishments for slacking were severe: flogging, extra labor, even death if you deserted or showed cowardice. Discipline wasn't just harsh, it was religious. Every soldier became part of a machine. They drilled endlessly: how to form ranks, how to hold a line under arrow fire, how to build a fortified camp in a single day. Roman camps weren't just tents thrown up on a hill. They were mini-cities, surrounded by trenches, palisades, roads laid out in strict grids. Soldiers could be building all day, fighting all night, and marching by morning. No complaints tolerated. And when it came to actual battle, Rome's enemies feared the army with good reason. The legions didn't fight like frenzied barbarians. They fought like surgeons, slow, relentless, precise. Tight formations, shield walls, short stabbing swords. They advanced like a wall of knives. No mercy for the defeated. Surrendering towns were sometimes spared. Often, they were massacred or sold wholesale into slavery. Total destruction, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, wasn't just rhetoric. It was Roman policy. The army wasn't only Romans, though. The farther the empire expanded, the more it filled its ranks with auxiliaries. Foreigners promised citizenship after their service. Syrian archers, Numidian cavalry, Germanic scouts. They bled for Rome, and many of them died without ever being recognized as true Romans. And what about death? For soldiers, and for most Romans, death wasn't terrifying. It was expected. It was everywhere. Romans had a complicated relationship with death and the afterlife. They didn't dream of heaven. The traditional belief was that after death your spirit, or your manes, passed into the underworld, a shadowy place ruled by Pluto and Proserpina. It wasn't about reward or punishment, it was just existence in a dimmer world. But the living had responsibilities. If your family didn't perform the right funeral rituals, the cremation, the prayers, the offerings, your spirit could become a lemur, a restless ghost. Unquiet dead were feared. A house haunted by a lemur could be abandoned, left to rot, because Romans believed these ghosts could harm the living. This fear shaped life. Every year in May, during the festival of Lemuria, Romans performed private rituals at home to appease any angry spirits. They would walk barefoot through their house at midnight, throwing black beans over their shoulders while chanting, "With these beans, I redeem me and mine," trying to bribe the dead to leave them in peace. Burial was sacred. By law, Romans could not bury the dead inside the city walls. Instead, tombs lined the roads outside the city, literal streets of the dead. Rich families built towering monuments. Poor people pooled money into collective graves called columbaria, niches where urns were stored together. And if you were a soldier who died far from home, maybe you got a quick grave by the roadside marked by a simple stone, maybe nothing at all. But no matter who you were, you wanted to be remembered. The worst fate in Roman thinking wasn't death, it was being forgotten. To die without descendants, without a tomb, without a name carved in stone, that was true death. Food in Rome wasn't grand banquets every day. For the vast majority, The urban poor, farmers, soldiers, daily meals were simple, repetitive, and frankly pretty grim. The staple food was pulse, a kind of porridge made from barley, wheat or spelt. Thick, bland, sometimes flavoured with a splash of olive oil or a sprinkle of salt, if you could afford it. Meat? Rare. Only the wealthy ate beef, pork or lamb regularly. The poor made do with beans, onions, lentils, and maybe, if luck was with them, a scrap of fish or a handful of olives. Bread was king. Cheap, filling, portable, essential for survival. In Rome itself, massive public bakeries churned out coarse loaves day and night. Grain was distributed to citizens through the annona, Rome's grain dole, the ancient equivalent of food stamps. Without it, tens of thousands would have starved. Wine was everywhere, but don't picture fine Bordeaux. Roman wine, especially what the poor drank, was rough, sour, often watered down and cut with honey or even seawater to kill the taste. Drunkenness wasn't exactly frowned upon either. It was part of daily life for many. Spoiled food was common. Without refrigeration, food spoiled fast, especially in the Mediterranean heat. Romans tried to mask rot with heavy spices, vinegar or fermentation. Fish sauce, garum, was a staple. A salty fermented liquid made from fish guts rotting in the sun. They poured it on everything. Sanitation was, in theory, better than in many later societies, but the reality was brutal. Rome's aqueducts were engineering marvels, delivering fresh water into public fountains, baths and homes if you were rich. Public baths were the pride of Roman civilization, open daily to men and women at different times, offering hot pools, cold plunges, saunas, massages. But these baths were also bacterial hotbeds. Water wasn't regularly changed. People relieved themselves directly in the pools. Skin diseases, lice and eye infections were rampant. Bath attendants used strigils, metal scrapers, to clean off oil and dirt from customers, but these were often reused without cleaning between people. Imagine the filth building up. Toilets were public too. Rows of stone seats with holes, all above open running water channels. No privacy, no toilet paper either. People wiped with communal sponges on sticks, rinsed between uses in dirty water. Disease was everywhere. Romans understood that cleanliness mattered, but they had no idea about bacteria or viruses. Illness was blamed on bad air, miasma, or angering the gods. Doctors were a mixed bag. Many were Greek slaves or freedmen with no formal training. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and an astonishing amount of herbal concoctions that mostly did nothing, or actively harmed the patient. Opium and wine were the best anaesthetics available. Surgery was brutal. No anaesthesia beyond alcohol, no sterilisation, no antibiotics. Infection killed far more than the knife did. In the countryside, medicine was even cruder. Faith healers, herbalists, and magic charms were the main options. Life expectancy was short. The average Roman, even counting the elite, probably lived around 25 to 30 years. Childhood was especially dangerous. Roughly half of Roman children died before age 10. Women faced deadly risks from childbirth, and plagues, like the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century AD, could wipe out huge chunks of the population overnight, and yet the city of Rome kept growing. Fed by constant immigration from the countryside, slaves from conquered lands, and the sheer pull of opportunity, even if that opportunity often meant poverty, disease, and back-breaking work. There is a classic saying of all roads lead to Rome. As a tourist or travel junkie, that might mean to you as a calling to go visit the Eternal City, gouging yourself with gelato and cappuccinos, throwing a coin into the Trevi fountain, and crossing another destination off of your bucket list. However, to ancient Romans, all roads lead to Rome was taken as a literal phrase. To anyone with the slightest knowledge of Roman history, Rome was known as a conqueror. The nation consisted of a strong army, a very wealthy leadership and engineering that surpassed all others. How does a civilization begin to build more off of that? The answer lies within their roads. Reaching vast locations all around the country of Italy, Rome was as interconnected as modern-day cities. Each road built meant more areas to send armies to take over land, generating more wealth and more opportunities. If that doesn't impress you enough, the fact that you're able to visit these roads today should. For example, the Via Appia Antica, the longest and oldest Roman road, is still in use today. Over 2,000 years later, and these roads are still supporting tourists and cars. How were these roads built to last so long? What is an ancient Roman road like today? In this report, I will cover these questions within 3 major sections: the construction of ancient Roman roads, major roads and classifications, and the Via Appia Antica. The greatest example of a well-built road is the ability to visit and walk on it over 2,000 years later. The construction of ancient Roman roads is a guide to a durable craftsmanship and material use, to which most of we still use today. Whether it's been military troops, travellers, animals, weather or tourists, these roads have seen it all. What went into the construction of these roads? Who used them? Why were they built in such specific locations? And what traits do we still use today? The process behind building a Roman road is made out of layers. The crew begins by digging parallel trenches named scoop ditches along the main roadway, keeping retaining walls up on both sides of the new road. These scoop ditches assisted with the structural integrity of the road, helping the road drain when it rains. The storm drains were dug around 40 feet apart. Between the 2 scoop ditches would start the main road. The crew digs a ditch 6 to 9 feet deep, or reaching bedrock and firm ground. This ditch is called the fossa. Using leftover earth from digging the storm drains, the crew packs a 3-foot layer into the bottom of the fossa, creating a foundation for the new road. Layered on top of this is sand or dry earth, called the pavimentum, labelled as layer A in figure 1 below, to level the surface. The main construction begins following the 4 common steps of every Roman road: the statumen, rudus, nucleus, and summum dorsum. On top of the pavimentum, the sand layer from previous, is the statumen. The statumen is composed of fist-size rock, averaging at least 2 inches in size. This layer was put down 10 to 24 inches thick. On top of the statumen is the rudus, a 9-inch thick layer of pottery shards or stone gravel mixed with lime mortar, creating a type of concrete. The nucleus is next, a mixture of sand, gravel and lime to create concrete, all compacted together with a roller to sit 12 inches thick. In some cases, the nucleus is the top layer of the road. To finish off the layers is the summum dorsum, a 6-inch layer of wet concrete and large flat stones in lime mortar. This layer has a slight curve to it for drainage purposes and would increase the longevity of the road with weather-related issues. Roman roads were more similar to roads today than we think. They would be lined with curbs built by upright slabs fitted into the sides after the rudus layer to hold the paving stones tightly in. Each road would have mile markers, named miliaria or lapides, to notify travellers to passing 1 Roman mile. 1,000 paces equal to 4,850 feet. These markers were built out of marble or granite and also listed the official who was in charge of that road section, repairs, and the current emperor or consul. In the Roman Forum, Emperor Augustus had placed a golden milestone, which can be found near the Temple of Saturn. Built by packed gravel, footpaths and sidewalks were included along the sides of the road. Along with these sidewalks was placed a higher block to stop traffic from running into the side. The blocks were placed around 12 feet apart and also assisted travellers to step up and mount horses or pack animals. Busier stretches of roads had areas for travellers to pull over and rest, just like rest stops you see on busy highways today. Along with these pull-off areas were state-run inns, houses for travellers to stay and rest while they were on their journey. These rest stops were called statios and could be found around every 10. Outside the cities, in the towns and on the small farms, people lived a much simpler life, dependent almost entirely on their own labour. The daily life of the average city dweller, however, was a lot different and most often routine. The urban areas of the empire, whether it was Rome, Pompeii, Antioch or Carthage, were magnets to many people who left smaller towns and farms seeking a better way of life. However, the unfulfilled promise of jobs forced countless people to live in the poorer parts of the city. The jobs they sought were often not there, resulting in an epidemic of homeless inhabitants. The work that was available to these new émigrés, however, was difficult to obtain. Slaves performed almost all of the menial jobs as well as many of the professions such as teachers, doctors, surgeons and architects. Most of the freedmen worked at various trades, for example, as bakers, fishmongers or carpenters. Occasionally, poor women would serve the affluent as hairdressers, midwives or dressmakers. As elsewhere, whether on a farm or in the city, daily life still centred on the home, and when people arrived in the city, their first concern was to find a place to live. Space was at a premium in a walled metropolis like Rome, and from the beginning little attention was paid to the housing needs of the people who migrated to the city. Tenements provided the best answer. The majority of Roman citizens, not all of them poor, lived in these apartment buildings or insulae. As early as 150 BCE, there were over 46,000 insulae throughout the city. Most of these ramshackle tenements were overcrowded and extremely dangerous, resulting in residents living in constant fear of fire, collapse, and in some areas there was the susceptibility to the flooding of the Tiber River. Initially, little concern from the city was given to designing straight or even wide streets. Streets, often unpaved, could be as narrow as 6 feet or as wide as 15, not allowing for easy access to these buildings if a fire did occur. It would take the Great Fire under Emperor Nero to improve this problem when streets were widened and balconies built to provide safety as well as access in time of an emergency. These flats were usually 5 to 7 stories in height, over 70 feet. However, because many of these tenements were deemed unsafe, laws were passed under Emperors Augustus and Trajan to keep them from becoming too tall. Unfortunately, these laws were rarely enforced. Poverty throughout the city was apparent, whether through one's lack of education or manner of dress, and life in these tenements reflected this disparity. The floor on which a person lived depended on one's income. The lower apartments, the ground floor or first floor of an insulae, were far more comfortable than the top floors. They were spacious, containing separate rooms for dining and sleeping, glazed windows, and, unlike the other floors, the rent was usually paid annually. The higher floors, where rent was paid by the day or week, were cramped, often with only one room to a family. A family lived in constant fear of eviction. They had no access to natural light, were hot in the summer and cold in the winter with little or no running water. This even meant a latrina or toilet. While the city's first sewer system or cloaca maxima had appeared in the 6th century BCE, it did not benefit those on the upper floors. Lower floors had access to running water and indoor toilets. Refuse, even human waste, was routinely dumped onto the streets, not only causing a terrible stench, but a breeding ground for disease. For many, the only alternative was to use the public toilets. Combine the lack of street lights. There was no foot traffic at night due to the high crime rate, the decaying buildings and the fear of fire. Life on the upper floors of the tenements was not very enjoyable for many of the poor. On the contrary, most of the wealthy residents, those who didn't live in villas outside the city, lived in a domus. These homes, at least in Rome, were usually located on Palatine Hill to be close to the imperial palace. As with many of the tenements, the front of this dwelling, especially in cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, often contained a shop where the owner would conduct daily business. Behind the shop was the atrium, a reception area where guests or clients were greeted and private business sometimes conducted. The atrium would often include a small shrine to a household or ancestral god. The ceiling of the atrium was open, and beneath this was a rectangular pool. On rainy days, the water that came through this opening was collected and used elsewhere in the domus. On either side of the atrium were smaller rooms called cubiculum, which served as bedrooms, libraries and offices. Of course, there was ample space available for a dining room or triclinium in the kitchen. To the rear of the domus was the family garden. A tradition stemming from the earlier Etruscans, gladiators appeared in Rome in 264 BCE. Gladiatorial games embodied the broader social context of their time. A gladiator was either a slave or a criminal, and the games were a way to redeem themselves from their criminal charges or fight for their freedom. The games quickly became a political tool. Gladiators provided a spectacle under controlled, albeit brutal, conditions to deter viewers from enacting the same crimes that had condemned the gladiators to the arena. Essentially, those who abused the social order would suffer the same brutality in front of hundreds of Roman civilians who valued a pervasive culture of violence. Originally, gladiatorial games were an homage to the dead. Armed combat was a funerary tribute to the dead, a kind of blood sacrifice believed to placate the dead. The first recorded gladiatorial funeral rite was for Junius Brutus Pera in 264 BCE. However, as time passed, the games lost their ceremonial purpose. They became increasingly performative, warping into a form of sport-related entertainment. In 105 BCE, the consuls P. Rutilius Rufus and Quintus Manilius Maximus arranged games for their political campaigns. From then on, the games became a way for politicians to curry favour with the public. The promise of being re-elected was stronger if they sponsored the games generously. By the end of the Republic, the games were so costly that Marcus Tullius Cicero passed a law that prohibited public figures from offering gladiatorial combat in the 2 years preceding their election to public office. Most gladiators were recruited from two groups: slaves and free volunteers. Slaves had no choice when becoming gladiators. Their master would sell them to a gladiatorial agent. Meanwhile, a volunteer signed himself to one. Consequently, a volunteer would surrender his civilian rights and consent to the violence he would inevitably experience in the arena. Unlike a slave, a volunteer received a signing bonus and the prospect of prize money if they won a battle, and his chances of glory advanced with every successful fight. A slave, if they served a minimum of 3 years, would be granted their freedom. Yet, this seldom occurred, as most slave gladiators died in the arena or served out the remainder of their lives as gladiators. The other subgroup from which gladiators were drawn were criminals. In ancient Rome, a criminal would either be condemned to the sword, ad gladium, or condemned to the training school, ad in ludum. While in most cases both were death sentences, by becoming a gladiator, the criminal could survive their sentence and win their freedom. Gladiators trained within a ludus gladiatorius, an institution managed by a lanista. Some ludus, however, were owned by wealthy investors who housed and trained troops of gladiators, a familia gladiatoria. In smaller gladiatorial establishments, the lanista doubled as a trainer, whereas in larger, more renowned training schools such as the Ludus Magnus, a magistra taught specific types of gladiatorial combat. The lanista ran the business side of the schools, leasing out the gladiators to wealthy nobles for gladiatorial shows, or munus. Superior gladiators with excellent weaponry skills were more expensive to hire, and these men were typically volunteer gladiators. Working under contract, however, was no different to the regime a slave followed in the gladiatorial schools. Both were beaten, whipped, and renounced their social privileges. As a gladiator, slave, or contracted, they were fundamentally social outcasts. Within the confines of the school, the gladiators trained at different posts. These followed a hierarchical rank from primus palus, the first post, right through to the 8th stratum, the lowest ranking. At the Carnuntum and the Ludus Magnus, the inside was shaped like an arena, which mimicked the landscape of the stadium. In Pompeii, the training arena was more rectangular. The type of training a gladiator received was based on their suitability and aptitude for specific armatures. Gladiatorial combat was a performative spectacle, as much as a brutal display of strength and vigilance. Recruits were, therefore, trained according to the type of combat spectators would most enjoy, and trainers could pick out which of the men were better suited for different types of combat. Various types of blows and techniques were taught at the Ludus Gladiatorius. There was a horizontal stab, punctim, and the chop, chisim, which required the gladiator to raise their arm during close combat. Finally, there was a variation of the punctim, which was a reverse grip on the sword, stabbing downwards as though the blade were a dagger. Gladiators were taught to master lethal weaponry skills to the extent that a shallow 49mm deep wound was fatal. Of course, killing their opponent too soon or without a drawn-out bloody battle would make for a poor show in the arena. On the flip side, if the show went for too long, the gladiators ran the risk of displeasing the crowd. Knowing how to use their weapon effectively and performatively was paramount. The standard of living was subpar for a gladiator. Men were housed in cramped quarters with several to a cell, sleeping on either cots or mattresses on the floor. The two gladiatorial schools in Pompeii were said to be relatively airy and open, unlike the congested pens of the Ludus Magnus and Carnuntum in Rome. Gladiators followed a carbohydrate-heavy diet to support their training, and because wheat and barley were relatively inexpensive, dinner consisted of a heavy gruel of beans and barley, which was called sagina, but amongst the gladiators, this was known as hordeari or barley men. Originally, the games occurred at irregular intervals throughout the year, typically when the Romans believed it necessary to pacify the wrath of a god. By the end of the Republic, however, historians contend there were 67 days allocated for games each year. If there were animal displays, they were presented in the morning before the gladiatorial combats began in the afternoon. Public executions via large animals such as lions or bears would have taken place in the morning. Gladiatorial contests occurred one pair at a time, and both opponents were matched based on their skill and size. They would enter the arena slowly so that the audience had the chance to size them up and hedge their bets on the winner. Then, without further stalling, the gladiators would fight until one of them won. The gladiators ensured they didn't finish the duel too quickly, as it was ultimately a performative contest. Audiences wanted to witness a stylish, technical fight. To entertain the crowd beyond their swordsmanship, gladiators were adorned in different regalia, based on the tribe from which they originated. A popular battle was between the Samnite and the Retiarius. The Samnite wore a plumed helmet, carried an oblong shield, and a sword was his weapon of choice. The Retiarius wore no helmet but had an armlet on his left arm to protect his head from a side blow. Retiarius defended themselves with a large net and a long trident or spear. Combat rarely ended with a death, unless the show had been advertised as a munus sine missione, a fight to the death. For a gladiator to surrender to their opponent, they would sink to the ground and raise a finger as a gesture of submission. His fate then was decided by the host of the show. The show host would receive a discount on every uninjured gladiator they returned to the school. Unless the gladiator was a convicted criminal condemned to death, it was cheaper to keep the gladiator alive. The chariot races were held in a circus arena with a racing floor, and most races required 7 laps. On race days, 24 races were run, and the games commenced with a solemn procession, starting at the Capitol and descending through the arena gates between the carceres. The procession was led by the presiding magistrate, and in his wake followed the competitors and images of the gods. Between the races, orchestral performances and trick riders, such as the Desultores, who leapt from one horse to another, dazzled the crowds. The Colosseum Games, first held under the Emperor Titus in 80 CE, showcased some of the most extravagant gladiatorial combats ever. 2 naval battles, Naumachia, were held at the Colosseum close to the date of its inauguration. Colossal lakes were excavated within the arena to mimic the naval landscape of famous battles, like the Corcyraeans destroying the Corinthian fleet. Often, the naval ships were filled with criminals rather than trained gladiators, and Naumachia was a form of public execution. Archaeologists have discovered holding cells beneath the Colosseum designed to release wild beasts into the arena. This form of brutalistic performance was known as venaciones. They were introduced when Italian expansion came into contact with Africa and the East. The Roman general Fulvius Nobilia was the first to exhibit a wild beast show in 186 BCE in celebration of his victory over the Aetolians. In later years, the hosts of the shows relied upon Eastern governors to supply them with a variety of animals for the games, including panthers, lions, and even rhinoceroses. If accounts from antiquity were true, 9,000 animals were slaughtered in a single show, either in fights between animals or hunted by one or more armed Roman huntsmen. Historians speculate that this number was vastly overestimated. Nonetheless, this number implies that large numbers of exotic animals were killed for the sake of entertainment. Venaciones were highly popular during the Empire and were a favoured form of capital punishment. Lions and bears were set upon criminals in the arena, and audiences would flock to the stadium to witness their execution. Romans valued justice in whatever violent form it took. Winning gladiators were crowned with a laurel and sometimes given a purse of coins, which was divided with their lanista. Marcus Aurelius set the dividends at 25% of the purse if free, and 20% for slaves. Experienced gladiators were known as veterans, and once they accrued enough wins, they could aspire to reach the status of primus palis, or first stake. Eventually, after serving their time and forging their career with the school, they could retire. Receiving the rudies, a wooden sword marked the end of their time in the arena. In rare cases, slaves who had worked their way up the gladiatorial hierarchy within the school were free to open their own businesses or move into the security trade, particularly during the tumultuous period of the late Republic. The Colosseum, alternatively known as the Flavian Amphitheatre, is arguably Rome's most well-known monument. The elliptical structure that spans 6 acres signifies the presence and importance of Roman engineering, tying in multiple engineering concepts within its structure. After first seeing the Colosseum, I was immediately drawn to the repeated concrete arches lining the perimeter. Knowing that the Colosseum served as a main source of entertainment for the people in the heart of the city, I was intrigued by the scale of the project and the vulgar practices that were seen as entertainment and power. The building itself once defined religion and culture for the Roman community. The striking appearance of the building was breathtaking, and I knew I wanted to study the Roman Empire's largest amphitheatre further. After viewing the exterior multiple times, taking an in-depth tour, then doing extensive literature and online research on the subject, I was able to learn and apply concepts about the history, construction, engineering, restoration, and modern-day use of the Roman Colosseum. Colosseum, giant amphitheatre built in Rome under the Flavian emperors. Construction of the Colosseum was begun sometime between 70 and 72 CE during the reign of Vespasian. It is located just east of the Palatine Hill, on the grounds of what was Nero's Golden House. The artificial lake that was the centrepiece of that palace complex was drained, and the Colosseum was sited there, a decision that was as much symbolic as it was practical. Vespasian, whose path to the throne had relatively humble beginnings, chose to replace the tyrannical emperor's private lake with a public amphitheatre that could host tens of thousands of Romans. The structure was officially dedicated in 80 CE by Titus, in a ceremony that included 100 days of games. Later, in 82 CE, Domitian completed the work by adding the uppermost story. Unlike earlier amphitheatres, which were nearly all dug into convenient hillsides for extra support, the Colosseum is a freestanding structure of stone and concrete, using a complex system of barrel vaults and groin vaults, and measuring 620 by 513 feet, 189 by 156 metres, overall. 3 of the arena's stories are encircled by arcades framed on the exterior by engaged columns in the Doric, Ionic and Corinthian orders. The structure's rising arrangement of columns became the basis of the Renaissance codification known as the assemblage of orders. The main structural framework and facade are travertine, the secondary walls are volcanic tufa, and the inner bowl and the arcade vaults are concrete. The amphitheatre seated some 50,000 spectators, who were shielded from the sun by a massive retractable velarium awning. Supporting masts extended from corbels built into the Colosseum's top, or attic story, and hundreds of Roman sailors were required to manipulate the rigging that extended and retracted the velarium. The Colosseum was the scene of thousands of hand-to-hand combats between gladiators, of contests between men and animals, and of many larger combats, including mock naval engagements. However, it is uncertain whether the arena was the site of the martyrdom of early Christians. In medieval times, The Colosseum was used as a church, then as a fortress by two prominent Roman families, the Frangipani and the Annibaldi. The Colosseum was damaged by lightning and earthquakes, and even more severely by vandalism and pollution. All the marble seats and decorative materials disappeared, as the site was treated as little more than a quarry for more than 1,000 years. Preservation of the Colosseum began in earnest in the 19th century, with notable efforts led by Pius VIII, and a restoration project was undertaken in the 1990s. It has long been one of Rome's major tourist attractions, receiving close to 7 million visitors annually. Changing exhibitions relating to the culture of ancient Rome are regularly mounted. A period of unrest and civil wars in the 1st century BCE marked the transition of Rome from a republic to an empire. This period encompassed the career of Julius Caesar, who eventually took full power over Rome as its dictator. After his assassination in 44 BCE, the triumvirate of Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, Caesar's nephew, ruled. It was not long before Octavian went to war against Antony in northern Africa, and after his victory at Actium, 31 BCE, he was crowned Rome's first emperor Augustus. His reign from 27 BCE to 14 CE was distinguished by stability and peace. Augustus established a form of government known as a principate, which combined some elements from the republic with the traditional powers of a monarchy. The Senate still functioned, though Augustus, as princeps, or first citizen, remained in control of the government. With a mind toward maintaining the structure of power entrusted to his rule, Augustus began thinking early about who should follow him. Death played havoc with his attempts to select his successor. He had no son, and his nephew Marcellus, his son-in-law Agrippa, and his grandsons Gaius and Lucius each predeceased him. He eventually chose Tiberius, a scion of the ultra-aristocratic Claudia Gens, and in 4 CE adopted him as his son. Tiberius, reigned 14 to 37, became the first successor in the Julio-Claudian dynasty and ruled as an able administrator but cruel tyrant. His great-nephew Caligula, 37 to 41, reigned as an absolutist, his short reign filled with reckless spending, callous murders, and humiliation of the Senate. Claudius, 41 to 54, centralised state finances in the imperial household, thus making rapid strides in organising the imperial bureaucracy, but was ruthless toward the senators and equites. Nero, 54 to 68, left administration to capable advisors for a few years, but then asserted himself as a vicious despot. He brought the dynasty to its end by being the first emperor to suffer damnatio memoriae. His reign was officially stricken from the record by order of the Senate. Following a war of succession, Vespasian became emperor, and the Flavian dynasty was established. His reign, 69 to 79, was noted for his reorganization of the army, making it more loyal and professional, for his expansion of the membership of the Senate, bringing in administrators with a sense of service, for his increase in systematization of taxation, and for his strengthening of the frontiers of the empire, though little new territory was added. The brief but popular reign of his son Titus, 79 to 81, was followed by the autocracy of Domitian, 81 to 96, Vespasian's other son, who fought the senatorial class and instituted taxes and confiscations for costly buildings, games, and shows. A reign of terror in his final years was ended by his assassination. The Flavian dynasty, like the Julio-Claudian, ended with an emperor whose memory was officially damned. Domitian was succeeded by an elderly senator of some distinction, Marcus Cocceius Nerva, 96 to 98. Among the beloved rulers of Rome that succeeded him were Trajan, reigned 98 to 117, Hadrian, 117 to 138, Antoninus Pius, 138 to 161, and Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180. Together these are known as the 5 good emperors. Their non-hereditary succession oversaw a golden age, which witnessed a considerable amount of expansion and consolidation. But all the changes that occurred during this era, beneficial as they were, brought with them the attendant evils of excessive centralization. The concentration of an empire in the hands of an emperor like Commodus, 180 to 192, juvenile, incompetent and decadent, was enough to steer it toward decline. The following century was plagued by strife and mismanagement. When the commander of the Danube army, Septimius Severus, was swept to power in 193, he effectively made Rome a military monarchy. The barbarian invasions weighed heavily on the empire, as did usurpations and political destabilization. The instability fed on itself and was responsible for heavy expenditure of both life and treasure. Disruptions in commerce, harsh taxation, inflation, and extortion from stationed troops all contributed to perpetual economic hardship for decades. A period of recovery began with Diocletian, 284 to 305, whose broad reforms renewed the integrity and cohesion of the imperial administration. His most notable adjustment was the reorganization of the empire into a tetrarchy, wherein power was divided among himself, Maximian, who became Augustus, or emperor in 286, Constantius, who became Caesar, or hereditary prince, in 293, and Galerius, who also became Caesar in 293. The arrangement proved practical in stabilizing the empire for a time against usurpation, and it also promised the rulers legitimacy and regular succession. The tetrarchy soon led to confusion, however, and by 308 there were 7 pretenders to the title of Augustus. Among them was Constantius's eldest son Constantine, who was passed over for formal succession. As a high-ranking military tribune, however, he had a forceful command and was able to eliminate his rivals successively in the west. He became the uncontested Emperor of the West in 312, and, upon the defeat of his co-emperor in the east, he became the sole Augustus of the empire in 324. Constantine's reign, 312 to 337, saw significant and lasting changes to the Roman Empire. Christians, who had been tolerated at best, but often tortured or killed, found new favour after the Edict of Milan, 313, assured toleration for all religions. From about 320, the Roman state no longer persecuted Christians, but rather showered Christian institutions with patronage. In 324, Constantine relocated the imperial capital to Byzantium, which was renamed Constantinople, a move whose strategic and economic benefits helped reinvigorate the state for some time. But Constantine failed to save the empire from decline. The last of his line, Theodosius I, 379 to 395, was the last emperor to rule over a unified Roman Empire. The Western Empire, suffering from repeated invasions and the flight of the peasants into the cities, had grown weak compared with the East, where spices and other exports virtually guaranteed wealth and stability. When Theodosius died, in 395, Rome split into Eastern and Western empires. The Tetrarchy soon led to confusion, however, and by 308 there were 7 pretenders to the title of Augustus. Among them was Constantius's eldest son Constantine, who was passed over for formal succession. As a high-ranking military tribune, however, he had a forceful command and was able to eliminate his rivals successively in the west. He became the uncontested Emperor of the West in 312, and, upon the defeat of his co-emperor in the east, he became the sole Augustus of the empire in 324. Constantine's reign, 312 to 337, saw significant and lasting changes to the Roman Empire. Christians, who had been tolerated at best, but often tortured or killed, found new favour after the Edict of Milan, 313, assured toleration for all religions. From about 320, the Roman state no longer persecuted Christians, but rather showered Christian institutions with patronage. In 324, Constantine relocated the imperial capital to Byzantium, which was renamed Constantinople, a move whose strategic and economic benefits helped reinvigorate the state for some time. But Constantine failed to save the empire from decline. The last of his line, Theodosius I, 379 to 395, was the last emperor to rule over a unified Roman Empire. The Western Empire, suffering from repeated invasions and the flight of the peasants into the cities, had grown weak compared with the East, where spices and other exports virtually guaranteed wealth and stability. When Theodosius died, in 395, Rome split into Eastern and Western empires. The West was severely shaken in 410, when the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, a wandering nation of Germanic peoples from the northeast. The fall of Rome was completed in 476, when the German chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus. The East, always richer and stronger, continued as the Byzantine Empire through the European Middle Ages. During the later Republic and most of the Empire, Rome was the dominant power in the entire Mediterranean basin, most of Western Europe, and large areas of northern Africa. The Romans possessed a powerful army and were gifted in the applied arts of law, government, city planning and statecraft, but they also acknowledged and adopted contributions of other ancient peoples, most notably those of the Greeks, much of whose culture was thereby preserved. The Roman Empire was distinguished not only for its outstanding army, the foundation upon which the whole empire rested, but also for its accomplishments in intellectual endeavours. Roman law, for example, was a considered and complex body of precedents and comments, which were all finely codified in the 6th century, see Justinian Code of. Rome's roads were without match in the ancient world, designed for comparatively fast transportation and adapted to a wide variety of functions: commerce, agriculture, mail delivery, pedestrian traffic and military movements. Roman city planners achieved unprecedented standards of hygiene with their plumbing, sewage disposal, dams and aqueducts. Roman architecture, though often imitative of Greek styles, was boldly planned and lavishly executed. Triumphal arches commemorated important state occasions, and the famous Roman baths were built to stir the senses as well as to cleanse the body. Finally, Latin, the language of the Romans, became the medium for a significant body of original works in Western civilization. Cicero's speeches, the histories of Livy and Tacitus, Terence's drama, and above, ancient Rome had a large influence on the modern world. Though it has been thousands of years since the Roman Empire flourished, we can still see evidence of it in our art, architecture, technology, literature, language, and law. From bridges and stadiums to books and the words we hear every day, the ancient Romans have left their mark on our world. Art and architecture. Ancient Romans have had a tremendous impact on art and architecture. We can find traces of Roman influence in forms and structures throughout the development of Western culture. Although the Romans were heavily influenced by ancient Greece, they were able to make improvements to certain borrowed Greek designs and inventions. For example, they continued the use of columns, but the form became more decorative and less structural in Roman buildings. Ancient Romans created curved roofs and large-scale arches, which were able to support more weight than the post and beam construction the Greeks used. These arches served as the foundation for the massive bridges and aqueducts the Romans created. The game-loving ancients also built large amphitheatres, including the Colosseum. The sports stadiums we see today, with their oval shapes and tiered seating, derive from the basic idea the Romans developed. The arches of the Colosseum are made out of cement, a remarkably strong building material the Romans made with what they had at hand: volcanic ash and volcanic rock. Modern scientists believe that the use of this ash is the reason that structures like the Colosseum still stand today. Roman underwater structures proved to be even sturdier. Seawater reacting with the volcanic ash created crystals that filled in the cracks in the concrete. To make a concrete this durable, modern builders must reinforce it with steel. So today, scientists study Roman concrete, hoping to match the success of the ancient master builders. Sculptural art of the period has proven to be fairly durable too. Romans made their statues out of marble, fashioning monuments to great human achievements and achievers. You can still see thousands of Roman artifacts today in museums all over the world. Technology and science. Ancient Romans pioneered advances in many areas of science and technology, establishing tools and methods that have ultimately shaped the way the world does certain things. The Romans were extremely adept engineers. They understood the laws of physics well enough to develop aqueducts and better ways to aid water flow. They harnessed water as energy for powering mines and mills. They also built an expansive road network, a great achievement at the time. Their roads were built by laying gravel and then paving with rock slabs. The Roman road system was so large, it was said that all roads lead to Rome. Along with large-scale engineering projects, the Romans also developed tools and methods for use in agriculture. The Romans became successful farmers due to their knowledge of climate, soil, and other planting-related subjects. They developed or refined ways to effectively plant crops and to irrigate and drain fields. Their techniques are still used by modern farmers, such as crop rotation, pruning, grafting, seed selection, and manuring. The Romans also used mills to process their grains from farming, which improved their efficiency and employed many people. Literature and language. Much of the literature of the world has been greatly influenced by the literature of the ancient Romans. During what is considered the golden age of Roman poetry, poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid produced works that have had an everlasting impact. Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example, inspired authors such as Chaucer, Milton, Dante, and Shakespeare. Shakespeare, in particular, was fascinated by the ancient Romans, who served as the inspiration for some of his plays, including Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. While Roman literature had a deep impact on the rest of the world, it is important to note the impact that the Roman language has had on the Western world. Ancient Romans spoke Latin, which spread throughout the world with the increase of Roman political power. Latin became the basis for a group of languages referred to as the Romance languages. These include French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and Catalan. Many Latin root words are also the foundation for many English words. The English alphabet is based on the Latin alphabet. Along with that, a lot of Latin is still used in the present-day justice system. The Roman Empire was a primarily polytheistic civilization, which meant that people recognized and worshipped multiple gods and goddesses. Despite the presence of monotheistic religions within the empire, such as Judaism and early Christianity, Romans honored multiple deities. They believed that these deities served a role in founding the Roman civilization, and that they helped shape the events of people's lives on a daily basis. Romans paid allegiance to the gods both in public spaces and in private homes. While the Roman state recognized main gods and goddesses by decorating public buildings and fountains with their images, families worshipping at home also put special emphasis on the deities of their choosing. The gods and goddesses of Greek culture significantly influenced the development of Roman deities and mythology. Due to Rome's geographic position, its citizens experienced frequent contact with the Greek peoples, who had expanded their territories into the Italian peninsula and Sicily. As the Roman Republic was rising to prominence, it acquired these Greek territories, bringing them under the administration of the Roman state. Romans adopted many aspects of Greek culture, adapting them slightly to suit their own needs. For example, many of the gods and goddesses of Greek and Roman culture share similar characteristics. However, these deities were renamed and effectively rebranded for a Roman context, possessing names that are different from their Greek counterparts. The main god and goddesses in Roman culture were Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Jupiter was a sky god who Romans believed oversaw all aspects of life. He is thought to have originated from the Greek god Zeus. Jupiter also concentrated on protecting the Roman state. Military commanders would pay homage to Jupiter at his temple after winning in battle. Juno was Jupiter's wife and sister. She resembled the Greek goddess Hera in that she kept a particularly watchful eye over women and all aspects of their lives. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom and craft. She watched over schoolchildren and craftspeople such as carpenters and stonemasons. Minerva is thought to be the equivalent of the goddess Athena, who was the Greek goddess of wisdom. Other Roman gods and goddesses who were adapted from Greek culture include Venus, who drew on Aphrodite, goddess of love, Neptune, a sea god who was inspired by the Greek god Poseidon, Pluto, who ruled the Roman underworld as the god Hades did in Greek culture, Diana, Roman goddess of the hunt who had her Greek equivalent in Artemis, and Mars, god of war, who was fashioned after the Greek god Ares. Just as the Greeks influenced Roman culture, the Romans inspired the cultural development of later societies. You may by now have noticed that many of the planets in our solar system were named after Roman deities. Rome did have some of its own gods and goddesses who did not trace their origins back to Greek culture. For example, Janus was a god with two faces that represented the spirit of passages such as doorways and gates. Believed to preside over beginnings, it is fitting that the month of January is named after Janus. Janus's son was Tiberanus, the god of the river Tiber, which runs through the city of Rome. According to Roman mythology, the gods had a hand in the founding of the city of Rome itself. Mars, god of war, and a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia were the parents of twin boys, Romulus and Remus. Vestal virgins were not permitted to marry or bear children, but were instead to devote their lives to serving Vesta, goddess of the hearth. It is said that King Amulius ordered that the twins be thrown into the Tiber River as a punishment to Rhea Silvia for betraying her vow of celibacy. Luckily, the boys were rescued from the river by a mother wolf. She helped to raise them until a local couple adopted them. As the boys grew up, they became important members of the community. They dethroned King Amulius and worked together to establish a new city. In a later argument about the city, however, Romulus killed his brother Remus. Romulus went on to name the city after himself, calling it Rome, or Roma. The presence and influence of gods and goddesses were integral parts of life in the Roman state. The people of Rome built temples to their gods and observed rituals and festivals to honour and celebrate them. Any favourable or unfavourable circumstances in Roman life could be attributed to the mood of certain gods, so people would likewise make offerings to the gods in thanks or in an attempt to appease their tempers. Unlike many monotheistic religious or spiritual traditions, the Romans' gods were seen as caring little about the morality of the Roman people. Rather, their chief concern was being paid tribute through very specific rituals. Spartacus was born in Thrace, an area where the modern-day Balkan states, including Turkey, Bulgaria and Greece, are located. Though little is known about Spartacus's early life, historians believe he may once have served in the Roman army. Spartacus was sold into slavery, perhaps due to rebellion against or desertion from the army. He was sent to the gladiatorial training school in Capua in 73 BCE. Soon after, he escaped with about 70 other gladiators and gathered his followers on nearby Mount Vesuvius. Gradually more escaped slaves joined their ranks. It is estimated that there were 90,000 to 100,000 men in all. Together they used guerrilla tactics to fight off Roman attacks. After about a year, the group mobilised and started travelling throughout the Roman Empire. They marched as far north as Gaul, modern-day France. Rome initially considered the revolt a nuisance. With each of Spartacus's victories, however, Roman leaders started to take the group more seriously. In 71 BCE, General Marcus Licinius Crassus defeated the rebel army at Lucania, about 56 kilometres, 35 miles southeast of Naples. Spartacus was believed to have died in this battle. Around 6,000 men survived the battle, but were later captured and crucified by the Roman army. Spartacus has long served as an inspiration to those seeking to revolt against oppressive rule. He was considered a brave and able leader who fought against tremendous odds with remarkable success. Hannibal was born in 247 BCE in Carthage, a powerful city in North Africa that was a threat to the Roman Republic in the Mediterranean. Hannibal's father, a Carthaginian general, made his son swear everlasting hostility to Rome. Hannibal kept his oath and devoted his life to defeating Rome. A successful officer in Carthage's army, Hannibal was proclaimed its leader when he was only 26. In 219 BCE, Hannibal led his army to attack Saguntum, a city in the middle of the eastern Spanish coast. Saguntum, however, was an ally of Rome, so Hannibal's attack and siege on the city led Roman Senate to declare war on Carthage. Hannibal's physical bravery and outstanding leadership skills created great loyalty among his troops. He assembled a massive army of 90,000 foot soldiers, a cavalry of 12,000, and at least 37 war elephants to march on Rome. Roman armies blocked the coastal route to Rome. Hannibal, determined to succeed, decided to march his men and elephants over the Alps in an amazing military campaign. The trip was difficult, and Hannibal lost many troops, as well as some elephants. Nevertheless, Hannibal's army penetrated the Italian peninsula and advanced slowly on Rome, spending the next 15 years fighting with Roman armies before having to retreat to Carthage. After Hannibal's retreat, Rome and Carthage engaged in a final battle, known as the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. It was a decisive Roman victory, and soon after, Carthage sued for peace. terms of the peace negatively affected Carthaginians. They permanently lost their overseas empire and were also forced to surrender their fleet. Hannibal was very unhappy with this and strongly resented Rome. Hannibal spent the next few years participating in politics, but ended up fleeing Carthage because his opponents denounced him to Rome for violating the terms of their peace treaty. Facing capture by the Roman army, Hannibal took his own life around 183 BCE. The Roman Republic describes the period in which the city-state of Rome existed as a republican government from 509 BCE to 27 BCE. Rome's republican government is one of the earliest examples of representative democracy in the world. Prior to the Republic, Etruscan kings who lived nearby in central Italy ruled Rome. Once the last of these kings was overthrown in 509 BCE, Rome's wealthiest citizens established a republican government by creating various assemblies of Roman citizens. These assemblies decided important matters for the city on behalf of its population. The early Republican Senate clearly held a bias towards the interests of the wealthiest citizens. After all, only members of the patrician class could hold office. Therefore, the plebeians, who made up the majority of the soldiers in the Roman army, staged protests outside the city walls. This conflict led to the establishment of other legislative bodies, such as the Concilium Plebis, or Council of Plebs, the Comitia Centuriata, and the Comita Tributa, or the Tribal Assemblies. In the Council of Plebs and Tribal Assemblies, laws would be passed based on the discussion of important issues that took place in the Senate. There, senators recommended which policies to implement. The Senate and Assemblies worked together to appoint executive officials called magistrates, enacted laws, and sought to increase Rome's territorial holdings throughout the Italian peninsula. The Republic began to engage in wars with its neighbouring rivals, slowly eliminating threats to its superiority in the Mediterranean. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic stood alone as the dominant power in the Mediterranean region. The Roman Republic was founded in 509 BCE after the last Etruscan king that ruled Rome was overthrown. Rome's next government served as a representative democracy in the form of a republic. Initially, Rome's wealthiest families, the patricians, held power, and only they could hold political or religious offices. Everyone else was considered plebeian, and no member of this group could hold office. Over a period of nearly 200 years, however, the plebeians fought for and gained power within the government. At the heart of the Roman Republic was the Senate. The Senate advised on matters pertaining to rules governing the city and population. In the Republic, members of the patrician class served as advisors to the other governing bodies of the Republic. Although the Senate did not formally make laws, the prestige of its members gave the Senate great influence over Rome's law-making bodies. The Senate lasted as a sole governing body for the Republic for only a brief time, lasting from the Republic's founding in 509 BCE until 494 BCE, when a strike orchestrated by the plebeians resulted in the establishment of the Concilium Plebis, or the Council of the Plebs. This gave the plebeians a voice in the government. As a result, new legislative or law-making bodies of the Roman Republic were formed. Called assemblies, these legislative bodies shared power in the following ways. Comitia Centuriata. This body decided about war, passed laws, elected magistrates, consuls, praetors and censors, considered appeals of capital convictions, and conducted foreign relations. Concilium Plebis. This body elected its own officials and formulated decrees for observance by the plebeian class. In 287 BCE, it gained the power to make all decrees binding for the entire Roman community. Comitia Tributa, the tribal assemblies, open to all citizens, who only could be free adult males, elected minor officials, approved legislative decisions often on local matters, and could wield judicial powers but could only levy fines rather than administer punishment. Leading the Republic were two consuls who were elected by legislative assemblies. They served for 1 year, presided over the Roman Senate, and commanded the Roman military. Though their power was somewhat limited by the establishment of other magistrate positions, the consuls were effectively the heads of state. The Republic stood strong for several centuries. However, as Rome's power and territory expanded, internal conflicts began to emerge as citizens and families struggled for power. For example, In the 1st century BCE, the famous Roman orator Marcus Cicero uncovered a plot by a Roman senator, Lucius Catiline, to overthrow the Roman government. Some citizens, such as the Gracchus brothers, attempted to institute government reforms and social reforms to help the poor. Ultimately, factions emerged, loyal to either the patrician or plebeian classes or to a specific military general. Hostilities erupted, and a series of civil wars plagued the Republic. During these civil wars, a prominent general and statesman named Julius Caesar began gaining significant power. He commanded the loyalty of the soldiers in his army and enjoyed access to substantial wealth after conquering the province of Gaul. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's power, demanded he give up command of his army and return to Rome as a citizen. Caesar refused, instead marching his army south directly into Rome. As a result, another civil war erupted between Caesar and his chief political rival Pompey. Caesar emerged victorious and was named dictator for life. Previously, the title dictator was given to an appointed and temporary leader in times of military emergency. Other leaders within the Republic feared Caesar would become a tyrant with this new title. To prevent this, a group of senators conspired and assassinated him. In response to Caesar's death, his nephew and heir Augustus defeated the conspirators. He then established himself as the first Roman emperor. The Roman Empire dramatically shifted power away from representative democracy to centralized imperial authority, with the emperor holding the most power. For example, under Augustus's reign, emperors gained the ability to introduce and veto laws, as well as command the army. Furthermore, the emperor wielded significant authority over those who served in lower-level executive positions. No citizen could hold office without the emperor's consent. As a result of this redistribution of power, the popular assemblies, when it comes to the history of ancient Rome, we have all been told that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and declared himself dictator. Likewise, many of us were taught how Emperor Constantine made Christianity the main religion of the Roman Empire after seeing a cross of light appear in the sky during an ill-fated battle. On the other hand, hardly anyone knows what the average Roman citizen ate for breakfast, when they were expected at work, or how they chose to spend their leisure hours. And that is a shame, because microhistorians have been able to piece together a startlingly clear picture of the way in which ancient Romans went about their day. For us, their accounts offer a window into the past. They treat Rome not as the mystified backdrop to a larger-than-life story, but as a living, breathing setting, a complex urban environment that millions of inhabitants once called their home, replete with dodgy neighbourhoods, traffic jams, yearly festivals, and many other things we rarely even consider. Mornings in Ancient Rome. In his 1936 book, Daily Life in Ancient Rome, historian Jérôme Carcopino describes the routines that define the existence of city dwellers during the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. An important distinction, not only because customs changed as rapidly in ancient times as they do today, but also because the experience of the townsman differed greatly from the peasant. Where one was surrounded by commerce and culture, the other remained tied to the land, which he worked without profit or respite. According to Carcopino, the citizens of ancient Rome started their day before sunrise. Some because they had to go to work, others because the noise of the streets prevented them from sleeping any longer. The laughter of the passing throng, wrote the poet Martial in an epigram, wakes me and Rome is at my bed's head. Schoolmasters in the morning do not let you live. Before daybreak, bakers, the hammers of the coppersmiths all day. Living in a time before electric light, all Roman citizens were determined to make the most out of their day and finish any and all business before sundown. As such, it should come as no surprise that they wasted no time getting ready in the morning. Their breakfasts usually consisted of a glass of water, and washing was saved for the afternoon, when they would visit the local bathhouses. Commuting to work could be a job in itself, depending on how far you had to go. Ancient Rome's rapid expansion and frequent fires turned the city layout into a tangled mess of streets and side roads, many of which were unpaved. To help ease traffic congestion, outside travellers were made to park their carts near the city gates and continue on foot. As decreed by Caesar, the only carts allowed on the street were those of building contractors. Afternoon activities. For most Romans, the workday began at dawn and ended around noon. The The entire afternoon was reserved for recreation. Ancient Rome had a lively leisure industry, meaning citizens could entertain themselves in any number of ways. They might see a play at the theatre, or watch races at the Circus Maximus. Of course, there was also the Colosseum. The Colosseum had a diverse programme. Aside from the famous gladiatorial matches, spectators could witness skilled hunters take down exotic animals imported from all four corners of the empire. On rare occasions, the Colosseum floor was flooded and filled with mock shipwrecks, so fighters could restage historic naval battles. Hungry onlookers could purchase various snacks from concession stands, ranging from almonds and quinces to plums and pomegranates. On days when no spectacles or shows were provided, continues Carcopino, the Roman filled up the time until supper with strolling or gambling, exercise, or a bath at the Thermae. The Thermae, or public bathhouses, were an indispensable part of Roman society. The city had been building them since the 3rd century BC, and, by the time of Pliny the Elder, their numbers were well into the thousands. Children entered the bathhouses free of charge, while adults paid around half a cent, a microscopic sum, says Carcopino. The primary feature of these thermae was every type of bath that ingenuity could devise, including hot baths, cold baths, hot air baths, and swimming pools. Most baths also included enclosed gardens, promenades, and space to exercise. The Romans practiced several sports, including a type of tennis played with the palm of the hand instead of a racket, and a ball game called harpastum that is somewhat comparable to rugby. Water was carried in through the city's aqueducts and heated via a complex of furnaces hidden within the walls or underneath the floors. They were tremendous feats of engineering and welcoming backdrops for social get-togethers. With so many different things to do, it was not uncommon for Roman citizens to spend multiple hours at the baths. The baths closed at sundown, though most left before that, so they would have ample time to eat. Supper was the most important meal in a Roman's day, considering breakfast consisted of water and lunch of bread with cheese and cold cuts. For patricians, supper could last anywhere between 1 and 4 hours. Banquets held by the most lavish emperors, meanwhile, were known to go on until midnight, sometimes even the early hours of the morning. If you were well off, supper was served in a dining room. In ancient Rome, dining rooms contained not tables and chairs, but reclining couches. These couches were arranged around square tables where the food would be laid out. Willing and able to defy the forces of gravity, Romans ate while lying on their side, their weight supported on one arm while the other was used to consume food. Households frequently invited guests. When they did, the host was expected to provide knives and spoons. These were used to prepare and serve food, but not eat it. This the Romans did primarily with their hands. As a consequence of that custom, food was typically served in bite-sized format. Furthermore, it was considered proper etiquette for a Roman to wash his hands before and after eating, and preferably between courses as well. Respectable suppers consisted of no less than 7 courses: hors d'oeuvres, 3 entrees, 2 roasts, and 1 dessert. The primary sources cited by Carcopino mention dishes like dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, and suckling pigs stuffed with dates. Greatest of all delicacies was the red mullet, a fish so difficult to catch that serving them could sometimes send a host into bankruptcy. During both dinner and supper, Romans drank various wines. These included honey wine and wine blended with resin and pine pitch. The latter variety was diluted by pouring it into a mixing bowl through a funnel strainer, and anyone who drank these heavy wines neat was considered abnormal and vicious, a mark for contumely. While patricians have become famous for their extravagance, plebeians valued modesty. Painted on the walls of one Pompey resident were dictums that spelled out proper dining etiquette. Spare thy neighbour's wife lascivious glances and ogling flatteries, and let modesty dwell in thy mouth. Be amiable and abstain from odious brawlings if thou canst. If not, let thy steps bear thee back again to thine own home. That walk home, however, was by no means a leisurely stroll, especially not if the banquet went on well into the evening. In normal times, writes Carcopino, night fell over the city like the shadow of a great danger. Everyone fled to his home, shut himself in, and barricaded the entrance. The shops fell silent, Safety chains were drawn across behind the leaves of the doors. The shutters of the flats were closed and the pots of flowers withdrawn from the windows they had adorned. Wealthy Romans, having exchanged goodbyes with their gracious hosts, were escorted home by an entourage of slaves with torches. Others had to find their way back in the dark, for there were no oil lamps outside to light the way. Most plebeians were left at the mercy of the city's watchmen. While these guards patrolled the city from dusk till dawn, ancient Rome was way too vast to monitor in its entirety. The daily routines of ancient Romans were markedly different from those of modern Europeans or even Italians. Thermae have long ceased to be the bedrock of Western civilization, and though lavish dinner parties still occur, they are now the exception rather than the norm. At the same time, we cannot help but see part of ourselves in this long-gone civilization, from the hustle and bustle that comes with living in a large city, to the many social institutions designed to keep us sane and foster a sense of community. Roman entertainment wasn't just for fun, it was political, social, and deeply tied to identity. Bread and circuses, panem et circenses, was the strategy. As long as the people were fed and distracted with spectacles, they wouldn't revolt, and the rulers knew it. The Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheatre, wasn't built for glory. It was built for control. Tens of thousands of Romans packed the stands baking in the sun to watch men, often slaves, prisoners or condemned criminals, fight to the death. Gladiators were both despised and adored. They lived in barracks, trained daily under brutal discipline, and fought with a variety of weapons: swords, nets, tridents, heavy shields, light daggers. Different types of gladiators fought each other, like a brutal chess game played with living pieces. A retiarius, armed with a net and trident, would face a secutor, heavily armoured with a short sword. The fights weren't always to the death. If a gladiator fought well, the crowd might shout for mercy. But if the emperor or games organiser, called the editor, wanted blood, the losing fighter would be killed on the spot, thumbs up or down. That popular image is a bit of Hollywood fiction. In truth, gestures varied. Often the crowd simply screamed, demanding a kill. Executions were another entertainment. During intermissions in the games, criminals were marched out and executed in front of the crowd. Sometimes it was simple beheading. Sometimes it was more elaborate. Damnatio ad bestias, condemned to be mauled by wild animals like lions, leopards or bears. Other times, they were forced to reenact mythological scenes where death was guaranteed, like being set on fire to play Hercules dying in agony. Chariot racing was even bigger than gladiator games. The Circus Maximus could seat over 150,000 people, maybe even 250,000 if you count standing room, making it the largest stadium in human history. Teams were divided by colour: reds, whites, blues, and greens, and fans were fiercely loyal, sometimes to the point of full-scale riots. Charioteers were the rock stars of their day. The best ones, like Gaius Appuleius Diocles, became millionaires, richer than many senators, by winning hundreds of races. The races were insanely dangerous. Tiny 2- or 4-horse chariots tearing around a sand track at breakneck speed, wheels shattering, horses colliding, drivers crashing and getting dragged to their deaths because reins were tied around their waists. Betting was rampant. Every class, from slaves to emperors, has placed bets, sometimes fortunes, on races. Gambling could ruin households, drive men into debt slavery and fuel corruption. Theatres also played a big role, but Roman theatre was different from Greek theatre. While Greek plays were often philosophical and tragic, Roman plays were bawdy, slapstick, and obsessed with crude humour. Bodily functions, adultery, drunkenness. Actors were considered low class. Most citizens preferred mime, live performances with rude jokes and physical comedy, or pantomime, interpretive dances telling mythological stories, usually very sensual and highly popular with the masses. And then there were public festivals, so many that by the 2nd century AD, almost half the Roman calendar was a holiday. Saturnalia, for example, turned the social order upside down. Masters served slaves, gambling was encouraged, gifts were exchanged, and the city dissolved into a frenzy of drinking and chaos for days. The common theme running through all Roman entertainment: violence, spectacle, indulgence, and a fierce loyalty to public life over private life. The Roman wasn't expected to stay home. He was expected to be part of the crowd, shouting, jeering, betting, living fully in the noise and blood and dust of Rome. It was survival, distraction, and identity all in one. To be Roman was to live surrounded by gods. Every act, every corner of life was tied to divine forces, but it wasn't about personal faith like today. It was about ritual, duty, and survival. The Romans believed they had a contract with the gods. Duat des. I give so that you may give. If you honoured the gods properly with prayers, offerings and ceremonies, they would bless you with good harvests, victories, children and health. Fail, and they might punish not just you, but your entire family, your city, even the empire itself. There were gods for everything. Major gods like Jupiter, king of the gods, Juno, protector of women, Mars, war, and Venus, love and beauty. But also minor gods: Cardia, hinges of doors; Terminus, boundary stones; Cloacina, sewers. A Roman household could have dozens of tiny shrines for spirits like the Lares, household guardians, and Penates, gods of the pantry and food stores. Before eating, drinking, travelling, marrying, buying a house, even sneezing, a Roman might perform a small ritual or prayer to stay in the god's favour. Temples dominated city skylines. Each city had its own sacred sites, but Rome itself had hundreds of temples, large and small. Priests and priestesses didn't preach. Their job was to perform correct rituals, maintain sacred calendars, and interpret the will of the gods, often through augury, the reading of bird flights and omens. Superstition wasn't on the side. It was deeply woven into everyday life. Romans were obsessed with omens. A black cat crossing your path, not necessarily bad, but a crow calling 3 times, lightning on the left, or a stumble at the temple steps. You might cancel your entire day's plans. Important officials wouldn't even start a journey or battle without consulting a soothsayer or augur. Dreams were also seen as messages from the gods. If you dreamed of fire, snakes, or certain animals, you might rush to a temple the next morning to ask the priest what it meant. The wrong dream could delay a senate meeting, a marriage, or even the launching of a military campaign. Magic and curses existed in a shadow world alongside official religion. Romans made curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with spells to harm enemies. They would bury them in graves or throw them into sacred wells to summon spirits against rivals. Lovers, business competitors, and courtroom opponents were frequent targets. Protective magic was everywhere too. People wore amulets shaped like phalluses, symbols of protection against the evil eye, or little silver hands making obscene gestures to ward off curses. The bulla, a protective charm worn by Roman children, was believed to keep away evil spirits until adulthood. Ghosts, lemures, were deeply feared. Romans believed the dead could come back if they were improperly buried, forgotten, or angry. Each May, Romans held the Lemuria festival to appease restless spirits. At midnight, the head of the household would walk barefoot through the home, throwing black beans over his shoulder and chanting ancient words to drive the ghosts away. Religion also glued Roman society together politically. Emperors were often declared divine after death, and sometimes even during life. To refuse to offer a pinch of incense at the emperor's altar wasn't just impiety, it was treason. Early Christians got into deep trouble with Roman authorities because they refused to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, spirit, or swear loyalty through ritual. The Roman religious mindset was pragmatic, flexible, and opportunistic. Conquered people's gods were often adopted into the Roman pantheon. When Rome expanded into Egypt, Isis became popular. When soldiers returned from the east, they brought back Mithras, a mysterious god of loyalty, courage, and hidden rites, worshipped in secret underground temples. Faith for a Roman was less about belief, and far more about practice. You could believe whatever you wanted privately, but in public you honoured the gods, kept the festivals, and didn't bring the wrath of the heavens down on yourself, your family, or your city. To eat in ancient Rome was not just to nourish your body, it was a public performance, a display of wealth, status, culture, and sometimes even your political loyalties. First, how you ate said everything about who you were. Poor Romans, slaves, peasants, common labourers ate quickly, often standing or sitting on stools. Their meals were simple: porridge, pulse made from grains like barley or spelt, bread, olives, vegetables, maybe a little salted fish or cheap wine. The rich, however, transformed eating into an art form. A wealthy Roman did not sit at the table. He reclined on a couch, propped up on his left elbow, eating with his right hand. The triclinium, literally 3 couches, was arranged in a U shape around a low table, allowing guests to lie close and talk easily while being served. Invitations to dinners, convivia, were highly sought after and politically important. Being invited showed you were accepted into the social elite. Being snubbed could destroy your reputation. Meals often started with the gustatio appetizer course, eggs, salad greens, oysters, lightly cooked vegetables. Sometimes tiny sausages or fried dormice, yes, actual dormice, considered delicacy. Then came the prima mensa, main course, which could be extravagantly rich: roast boar with honey-glazed peacocks stuffed with other birds, flamingo tongues, regarded as a special treat, fish prepared with exotic spices from India and Africa. Romans loved sauces, especially garum, a fermented fish sauce that they poured over almost everything. The smell of garum could be overwhelming, salty, pungent, almost rotten. But to a Roman nose, it was the scent of luxury. The final part, secunda mensa, dessert, brought out fruits, dates, figs, grapes, nuts, and sweetened pastries. Roman desserts often used honey, as sugar wasn't yet known in the Mediterranean world. Wine flowed freely, but it was always mixed with water. Drinking unmixed wine was seen as barbaric and uncivilized. Depending on the setting, the water might even be warmed or flavoured with herbs and flowers. At a wealthy banquet, entertainment was essential. Dancers, musicians, acrobats, poets, and even professional jesters moved among the guests. If the host was really showing off, there might be performances of short plays or contests of wit. Conversation topics were carefully chosen: politics, philosophy, gossip about the elite, tales of conquest and bravery, all part of the Roman verbal dance. It was a delicate game, appear clever but not arrogant, bold but not reckless, cultured but not pedantic. Behind the scenes, an army of slaves worked tirelessly. Some managed the kitchens, sometimes entire wings of a house were just for cooking. Others circulated with platters, poured wine, cleaned spills, and attended to every small whim of the guests. And yet, for all this splendour, a Roman feast could turn into chaos. The later the night went, the rowdier things became. Drunken arguments, poetry duels, even fights were not uncommon. Some feasts deliberately ended with vomiting, not out of excess, but as part of the party, so the guests could continue eating and drinking. The Romans even had a phrase for the concept of a party becoming wild: commissatio. Food was also deeply tied to religious rituals. Offerings were made before major meals. A few drops of wine spilled on the ground, a piece of bread burned on the household hearth, to thank the gods and invite their blessing. The food supply itself was a massive system. Rome depended on grain imports from North Africa and Egypt. Without them, the vast population, over 1 million people at Rome's peak, would have starved. Managing the grain dole, annona, free or subsidised grain for the urban poor, became a vital part of Roman politics. A shortage could trigger riots. Plenty could secure an emperor's popularity. Bread was life. Bakers were highly respected tradesmen. The standard loaf, panis quadratus, was often stamped with a baker's mark, a circular loaf scored into sections like a modern pizza. Rich Romans had elaborate private kitchens, but many common people bought hot food from street vendors. Early fast food, Roman style. Perhaps no figure from ancient Rome is as famous as the gladiator, a warrior of the arena that fought to the death against beasts, criminals, and other gladiators for the entertainment of Roman society. Gladiators have become heavily mythologized figures, in part thanks to famous works of fiction like the film Gladiator, directed by Ridley Scott and starring Russell Crowe, or the classic Spartacus. But what were they like, really? Most Roman gladiators were de facto slaves, and as such had no rights in Roman society and were scarcely considered people. For every epic story of a gladiator becoming a legend of the arena and winning fame and freedom, thousands of others died anonymously on the sand. They led violent, dangerous lives and were subject to the whims of their superiors. Some managed to overcome these circumstances and became celebrities, but they were a very small minority. Types of gladiators. There were over 24 different types of gladiators, distinguished from each other by the weapons they used, the armour they wore, the fighting styles they employed, and the events at which they fought. Below you will find a list of the most recognisable ones. Mumio, heavily armoured gladiators that used a large oblong shield and a sword called a gladius. Their most distinctive trait was the full cover helmet decorated with a fish-shaped crest. Thraxes, which wore similar armour to the Mumillo, but who used a smaller rectangular shield and a curved Thracian sword. Their helmet also covered the entire head, but was decorated with a griffin instead of a fish. Retiarius, the famous gladiators wielding a large net and a trident. They wore lighter armour and had no shield, and fought by attempting to trap their opponents under their net and stabbing at them with their three-pronged spear. Esidarius, which were mounted gladiators. There is little information on them beyond that they fought mounted on chariots. Hoplomachus, which translates to armed fighter, in Greek, were gladiators who carried a throwing spear, a short sword, a small round shield, and who sported a plumed helmet. Were there women gladiators? There were female gladiators, although they were a very small minority, and according to writings from the times, they were apparently viewed as an oddity and a peculiar entertainment, more than as simply a regular type of gladiator. Gladiator training. Gladiators belonged to the infame class, infamous, and as such their lives were forfeit and belonged to their masters. Gladiatorial schools were incredibly strict, and the training they provided was harsh, with some archaeological evidence suggesting that gladiators could be killed as punishment for misbehaviour. In school, gladiators would likely train under a master who was an expert in their particular style of combat, and all the different groups were kept separate from each other, possibly so as to avoid conflicts between combatants who would meet in the arena. Upon entering gladiator school, those who had not been condemned to it as punishment for a crime, gladiators would sign a contract stipulating the type of combatant they would become, how many times a year they would fight, and signing themselves over into the property of their master. Famous gladiators. Most gladiators lived and died anonymously, but a few became popular celebrities and their names have reached the present day. Crixus was a Gallic slave and gladiator that escaped captivity and became one of the leaders of the rebel army in the Third Servile War between slaves and the Roman Republic. Emperor Commodus, portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix in the film Gladiator, was a known fan of gladiator combat and ventured into the arena himself many times. However, he was known to be a cruel fighter who used the privilege of his position to set up fights against handicapped opponents who had no chance of fighting back and whom he would maim and kill in often sadistic spectacles. This earned him great antipathy and is said to have contributed to his eventual assassination. Priscus and Verus were a pair of gladiators who had the honour of fighting each other at the inauguration of the Flavian Amphitheatre. It is said that after battling for hours they agreed to end the fight in a draw, at which point Emperor Titus granted them the rudies, making them free men. Spiculus was a rock star of the gladiatorial world. He was a favourite of the bloody Emperor Nero, who lavished him with gifts. When overthrown, Nero called on him because he wanted to die at his hands, but Spiculus didn't respond to the former emperor's request, and Nero was forced to kill himself. Was Spartacus a real person? Spartacus is without a doubt the most famous gladiator of the Roman Empire, and he was in fact a real person. He was a Thracian soldier, or mercenary, who ended up being sold as slave and then became a gladiator. He was one of the leaders of a revolt at the gladiator school of Capua, which ended in 70 of the trainees escaping. After their escape and some subsequent skirmishes with the Roman military, which the gladiators won, their ranks grew until they became an army of multiple tens of thousands. Spartacus led this rebel slave army in what came to be known as the Third Servile War, until his forces were routed and he was supposedly killed in 71 BC. Most often, gladiators engaged in one-on-one combat and would be paired against different types that were considered complementary. Mamios often fought against Thracians, as well as Hoplomachus and Retiarius. Retiarius, net and trident wielders, usually faced gladiators armed with more conventional weapons. Fights were highly organised and monitored by referees. Not all ended in death. Often a fight would end without either combatant dying. The reason for this was quite simple. Training and maintaining a stable of gladiators was expensive, so their owners wanted them to survive as long as possible. In the early years of the Colosseum, more fights were to the death, but as time went on, the contest became less lethal because replacing dead gladiators was costly. There were other types of violent entertainment that were popular in ancient Rome that have often been connected with gladiators, but which were in fact separate from them. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire in 27 BCE when Julius Caesar's adopted son, best known as Augustus, became the ruler of Rome. Augustus established an autocratic form of government, where he was the sole ruler and made all important decisions. Although we refer to him as Rome's first emperor, Augustus never took the title of king or emperor, nor did his successors. They preferred to call themselves princeps, first citizen, or primus inter pares, first among peers. This choice of title maintained the appearance of limited power that had been so important under the Republic. Many of the reforms enacted by Augustus and his successors had a deep and lasting impact on the internal political and economic structures of Rome. Pax Romana, literally Roman peace, is a term often given to the period between 27 BCE and 180 CE, during which Roman rule was relatively stable and war less frequent. There were conflicts such as provincial revolts and wars along the frontier. See the map below showing the extent of Roman control. But Rome experienced nothing like the civil wars that dominated much of the 1st century BCE. The emperors and the Senate took over most elections and simply chose who they wanted for office, so there were fewer elected political offices to fight over. Augustus, who, it should be pointed out, came to power through victory in a civil war, ended a string of damaging internal conflicts. Internal stability had positive effects on foreign relations. Because the political and social structures of the empire that Augustus established remained largely unchanged for several centuries, Rome was able to establish regular trade with India and China, further increasing its material wealth through more peaceful means. Augustus and his successors worked hard to maintain much of the image of the Republic while, in practice, they exercised something close to absolute power. Under the Republic, power was shared among many office holders and limited to short terms. Augustus altered this system by taking many of the offices and their powers for himself, while maintaining the idea that these were still separate offices that could, at least in theory, be transferred to someone else. For example, he was the Pontifex Maximus, High Priest, and also the Censor, Overseer of censuses for purposes of taxation, but he never got rid of the offices themselves. A major component of Augustus's new power was his control over the military. Under the Republic, the elected consuls served as military commanders during their one-year terms. This occasionally changed in practice, especially during the civil wars of the 1st century BCE, but the general idea that a military command was always temporary was important to the Romans. So, rather than claiming military power outright, Augustus took control as the stand-in governor of the most dangerous Roman provinces, where the majority of the Roman legions were stationed. This was a clever move because it gave Augustus control of the army, while at the same time making it appear that he was doing a favour to the people of Rome. Under the empire, Roman currency was not just an economic tool, it was a political tool as well. Julius Caesar, Augustus's adopted father, had been the first Roman to put his own portrait on coins, and Augustus continued this practice. Prior to Caesar, only dead Romans or gods were shown on coins. Placing the current emperor's portrait on coins reinforced the connection between economic power and the emperor, and also helped to shape the popular image of the emperor among the Roman people. Emperors would also use imagery on coins to popularize other family members, political allies, and especially their chosen heirs. Much of the technology used by the Romans remained relatively similar between the Republic and the Empire. However, Augustus altered the systems for overseeing public works, including roads, aqueducts, and sewers. He made permanent the positions of those who oversaw the construction and maintenance of these projects, which helped improve accountability. It also provided a way for the emperor to reward his supporters with important and secure jobs. Augustus both directly commissioned and indirectly encouraged the construction of multiple temples, a new forum, bathhouses, and theatres. He also erected a monumental arch and the famous Ara Pacis, altar of Augustan peace. These projects helped to solidify Augustus's power and also served the more concrete purposes of beautifying the city and reducing fire hazards. Stone buildings were less susceptible to fires, which had been a frequent source of property damage throughout Roman history. Like many important and affluent Romans before him, Augustus lived in a typical Roman house on the Palatine Hill in the city of Rome, adding to the illusion that he was just another wealthy citizen. Later emperors took up residence on the Palatine and built an imperial palace on the hill.